Today we're going to be building a property sharing marketplace just like Airbnb without writing a single line of code using a tool called Bubble. Now there's so much that I want to cover within this tutorial, but before I say another word, I just want to show you a quick preview of what we're going to be building today. Over in my browser here, I'm currently on my home page, and as you can see, this looks just like the real world Airbnb product. At the top, we have our navigation and search menu, which will allow us to navigate between all of the different pages in our app. We then have a list of categories that we can filter properties through. And then of course, below this, we have a list of all of our properties. And of course, it goes without saying that this page is also fully responsive, regardless of what size a user's browser is, or even what device they're using. So this is going to work perfectly across both desktop and mobile devices. Let's say I want to perform a search for a specific location within our marketplace today. What I can do is select on my search bar here, and then this is going to expand out. Let's say I want to search for properties in San Francisco, and I want to travel between these two dates. I can also select that I want to add 2 adult guests within my search. I'll then choose to perform this search. It's then going to redirect us through to a dedicated search page, where we're not only going to see a list of all of the relevant properties that match our search criteria, but we're also going to see a map of where all of those properties are within the actual search location. So this just gives me a good idea of where these properties are going to be located. Now let's say I'd like to view this specific property here. I'm going to click on this, then it's going to redirect me through to its dedicated property page, which is going to allow me to see all of the images uploaded for this property, as well as all of the details and even the amenities for this property. If I wanted, I could choose to add this property to my bookmark list. And then even further down, it's going to display a list of all of the reviews that this property has received, which of course, just as a guest, it provides some additional insight about the property and the host. If I scroll on up, what I'll also see is that the initial search dates that I had added into my search have been carried through to my calendar input fields here. And I can also see that the adult count I'd initially input has also carried across. Let's say I'd like to make this reservation. I can click this button here. It will trigger a pop-up which will allow me to confirm my booking, which when I click on this button, it's going to redirect me through to a Stripe dashboard, which will allow me to process this transaction. So I can select to pay for this here. Then once my transaction has processed, my booking will be made. And then over on a dedicated trips page, I can see a list of all of my upcoming reservations, as well as a list of all of my previous bookings. And of course, if I'd like, I could leave a review for this property here. So I could just share my thoughts here, as well as select a star rating. Let's say I'll give this 4.5 stars. And then finally, I can also choose to submit this review. And this, of course, is just a taste of what we're going to be building today. There's still so much happening behind the scenes that I'm super excited to show you. If you've ever wanted to build your own app or startup, you'll know firsthand how complicated it can be bringing your vision to life. You've probably tried to source a technical co-founder who can code, or you've probably asked someone to build the app for you, only to find out that it's going to cost an arm and a leg, and maybe even a left kidney. But if you're looking to find the most cost and time effective way to bring your app to life, as well as of course a way to keep all of your limbs intact, Bubble's going to be your new best friend within your startup journey. Bubble is what's known as a no-code tool, which in simple terms just means it allows you to build fully fledged apps without writing a single line of code using their visual interface. When it comes to no-code tools, Bubble is by far my favorite, as it gives you the ability to not only create your own custom database, but also build out the design of your app, stitch everything together and make it functional using workflows, and of course the ability to integrate with third-party tools and services. Now I've said it before and I'll say it again, but each one of these features would be a standalone tool. So the fact that Bubble includes all of those into one platform truly blows my mind. And if I'm going to be real, it's going to save you a ton of money having to subscribe to 4 different services to create one single platform. Look, there is a ton that I want to cover within our tutorial today, and I can't wait to show you what I've been cooking up behind the scenes. So let's grab our Bubble editor and we can dive right into it. The very first thing I wanted to cover within our tutorial today isn't actually going to be a core user-facing feature. Instead, I wanted to take the time to build out the necessary data types and data fields within our Airbnb database, which of course is going to be used to power the entire Airbnb product today. Now, when it comes to this database, this is by far one of the bigger databases that I've had to build out. And so there is so much that I need to cover throughout this process. And in order to help me keep track of where I am throughout my build today, I've just created a Notion checklist, which just includes a list of all of my database structure, as well as a list of all of the features I'm going to be walking us through in our tutorial. As you can see, there is a ton of features that I want to cover because this is by far one of the bigger builds I've ever created for a tutorial. And so I'm just going to get straight into the process. One thing I'll just point out though is that if you'd like to follow along with my Notion checklist, I'll of course be sure to include a link to this. So that way you can create a duplicate of this and follow along. What I love about Notion is that it just allows you to tick items off as you add them into the build. So that way you can keep a better track of where you are. Now, if you're relatively new to Bubble, and this is your first database you're creating, database structure can be one of the most overwhelming things when it comes to Bubble. However, it's one of the most important things you'll need to create because it truly does power the rest of your application. So when I approach a Bubble build, the first thing I'll normally do before I even touch any of the design or build any features is just build out all of the data types and fields I need. And before I even add those into Bubble, I like to just structure it out within a document like this, just so I can get a general overview of how our app's going to function. Now, if we were to jump over into a brand new Bubble editor that I've created here and open up our data tab, mine's just below my little screen recorder there, what you'll see under your data types tab is that you'll actually have two separate columns. So within Bubble, you have the ability to create what's known as a data type and also what's known as a data field. And now your data types will be displayed on the left-hand side here. And a data type is an overall thing or an entity that someone will create within your app. So by default, what you'll see is that Bubble already gives you a user data type. And that's just because if someone needs to use your application, they're going to need to register an account. So this user data type is already added by default by Bubble. And so if someone did want to register an account, it would create a new entry within our database. And it would register that person as a user. And now within our user data type on the right hand side here, you'll see what's known as your data fields. Now data fields allow you to store all of the information you'd like within your data type. So for every person that registers an account within our user data type, we might want to know some things like their name, their profile photo, their email, their bio. The list really goes on. And what you'll see is that Bubble actually gives you a pre-vetted list of data fields that it's added into our user data type. So by default, a user has to register an email. So Bubble's already added that field in for us. It will also have a password field for their account, but you just won't be able to see that in plain text for security reasons. Now, before we build out any data fields, we'll need to add in our data types first. So within my Notion checklist here, I've just created a list of a couple of different data types. And so you can see I have my user data type here, I have a property data type, and the list goes on. And I'm going to explain the importance of each one of these as I add them into my database. So let's jump over into our Bubble editor once again, and we're going to add in a new data type called a property. Now, the reason why I'm creating a property data type is because whenever someone would like to list a property on our marketplace today, they're going to need to create a new property. And so because a user is going to be creating a thing, in this case, a new property, this is going to be its own data type. So I'm going to choose to create this. Then if I just jump back into Notion, I'm going to scroll on down to view the list of additional data types. And what you'll see here is that I've added a separate data type, which is known as property images. And now the reason I've done this is to help the overall performance of our application. And so if you are new to building databases in Bubble, this might seem like a little bit more of an advanced feature. But of course, I'm going to explain why I'm doing that in a moment. But essentially, for every property that's created, you can see I have a long list of data fields that I'd like to store within this. So for every property, I want to identify its name, a description, an address, how much it's going to be per night. And look, all of these data fields I'm adding in are relatively small bits of information. So for instance, the number of adults that this property can sleep is just going to be a number. So if I'm storing all of these small data fields onto our overall data type, it's not going to weigh it down too much in terms of how quickly the application will be able to load our list of properties. However, when you start to work with large files like images or even things like video, if I was to add those onto my overall property data type, and if someone was to upload, let's say 5 or 10 photos to each property, if I then went to load a list of properties on my homepage, I not only have to load every single data field here, but I would also have to load the list of images stored within it. And that's where you can start to run into some performance issues when you're building out your Bubble app. So if you're trying to force Bubble to load all of this large data at once, it's definitely going to slow down quite quickly. And so a great way we can start building our application for scalability is by splitting our images into a separate data type and then just linking it back to our original property data type. So whenever someone uploads a property, I'd obviously like them to upload a list of images. But if I just separate this list of images into a different data type, it's not going to load these directly within the property. So that way when I'm loading a list of properties on my homepage, it's no longer going to load all of the images associated with it, which just means it's going to help speed up how much data can load from my database. And look, when I build out the data fields within each of these data types, it's going to make a lot more sense. But for the time being, I'm just going to add a property images data type into my database here. So I'm going to type in property images. I will create that. Then if I jump back into Notion, I can see that there's 2 additional data types here. There's one for our booking. So every single time someone wants to make a booking, or I guess you could say a reservation in our app, I want to create a record of that. So I'm going to jump into Bubble. I'm going to create a booking. And the last data type was going to be a review. So every single time someone has stayed at a property, I'm going to give them the option to leave a review for that host as well as that property. And so in that case, they would be creating a new review entry in our database whenever they want to share their thoughts. So I'm going to create this data type here. Now, before we move on to adding in all of our data fields, one thing I should point out is that you may have noticed under our user data type, we have this text that just identifies that there's a privacy rule applied to this. And if I click on this, it's going to take me through to my privacy tab here. Now, by default, Bubble's going to add a privacy rule onto your user data type, which essentially just means that users are only able to see the information that they create in your application. So if a user was to create a property, they would be the only person who's able to view that. And look, that's not the experience we want to create. Today, we're building an open marketplace where I want people to be able to see properties from other hosts, as well as leave reviews for other people. And so this privacy rule is actually not the experience we want to create. So I'm going to head over to my little trash can icon and choose to delete this here. I can then jump back into my data types tab here. And at this point, we've added all of our data types into our database. But of course, from here, I'm going to throw another spanner in the works and make things even more confusing. So I apologize if this truly is just going over your head at this point in time, but bear with me because I'm going to explain everything in as much detail as I can here. Look, if I jump back into my Notion checklist, you can see that I've added in all of my overarching data types. But what I'd also like to do is add in what's known as a list of option sets. Now, option sets in your database are like data types. So they're a great way of storing information in your database, but option sets are perfect for storing a list of static information. And what I mean by that is if I was to jump into Bubble and look at our existing data types, these are all bits of information that our users are going to create in our database today. So every single time someone registers an account, they're going to create a new user account in our database. Whenever someone creates a property, they will be the person who creates a property. And then whenever they want to make a booking, they will create an entry within our booking data type. But what happens if we, as the admin of our application, want to just store some permanent data in our database that's not going to change, and we don't want our users to be able to actually access that data, we only want to display it to them. And so a great example is, let's say if I wanted to create a list of categories that belong to every single property. So whenever someone creates a property, they should have the ability to link a category to that property. So if it is a cabin, if it's a tiny home, or even if it's an Airbnb Luxe, I essentially want someone to be able to identify which categories are relevant to the property they create. But instead of allowing the user the control to type in whatever category they would like, I, as the admin of our application, want to determine what categories they can select from. Because if we were to give control to our users, there's no guaranteeing that they won't add in any typos or even create duplicate categories. Because I'm going to be real, people really have no idea what they're doing when it comes to technology at the best of times. So we want to make sure we don't leave anything up to chance. And so this is where the feature known as option sets can come into play. Within your data tab, you'll notice in the top menu, you have a list here called option sets. And if we were to just skip this tutorial here, what you'll notice is that our option sets menu here kind of looks like the process of where we created a data type. So on the left-hand side here, you have the ability to create a new permanent thing in your database. So to my example before, if we wanted to create a list of categories, and I think the best way to just illustrate this is by jumping back into my Notion checklist. So you'll see I have a couple of different option sets that I want to add in today. So these are all lists of items, and one of the examples is a category. So I might actually add this one in first. But as I mentioned, I want to be the one who creates the list of categories that people can select from. And I only want users to be able to select from this list of options. And so what I can do with option sets is choose to create these values in my database. And these are going to be what's known as static values. Because essentially these values aren't going to change. They're always going to remain the same. Whereas let's say if someone was to create a property, which is a data type, every property is going to be different. It's going to have a different name. It's going to have different images. No two properties are going to be the same. Whereas with our list of option sets, the entire list here is always going to be this exact list, unless I as the admin decide to go in and make any changes to it. And so this is just going to give me full control over everything in my database here. And now if I was to add this list of option sets into my database, I would essentially just jump into Bubble, and within our data tab, we have the dedicated section devoted towards our option sets. So if I was to create a new option set called categories here, what you'll see is that it's created almost like a data type on the left-hand side. And on the right-hand side, we have similar to our data fields. Now within each option set, we can simply just add in a list of all of the options that someone can select from. So for my categories here, I just have a list set out within my Notion checklist. So I've got things like a lakefront stay, beaches, cabins, tiny homes, islands. And the way I sourced these categories was that I just went to Airbnb's real product. And at the top of the homepage, you'll see a list of categories that you can filter through. And so I just copied all of these categories here. And when it comes to our homepage, we're going to create an exact same experience today. So across the top of our page, we're going to display a list of categories. And the categories are of course going to be pulled from our option set list. So these are going to be all of the categories that we create here. And we are the only people who are going to be able to create categories, not our users. And so if I was to just jump into my Bubble editor here, I'm going to start adding my list of categories in. So my first category was lakefront, then there was beaches, followed by cabins. And look, I'm not going to bore you with the details by making you watch me add in every single category. So I'm just going to work some magic here and just skip ahead to when I finished adding my list in.
A few moments later.
Alrighty, so I've just finished adding in all of my option set lists. Of course, if you'd like to add in the exact same list as mine, you can jump to my Notion checklist and just add all of my options in. Or you could even go to the Airbnb product and just copy across all of their list of categories. One thing I would just like to point out though is that within your option set list, we obviously have a list of different categories. But one thing you may not know is that you also have the ability to customize the data you store within each category. And you'll see at the top here, there's some text that just highlights that you have attributes within each option. And so an attribute is kind of like what data you can store within the option within your list. So let's say for my lakefront, I have a single attribute, which is just known as my display. So this is just a text field. And this is just going to be the actual name of this option. So the display text in this case is lakefront. The display for the second one is beaches. And the reason I'm pointing out what attributes are is that because if we look at the real world Airbnb product here, within each category, we not only have a text field, but we also have an image associated with it. So that's like this little icon here. And I actually want to just copy the exact same icons they have above each category title. And so what we can do is jump back into our bubble editor and we can create a new attribute within each option. So if I create an attribute here, I'm just going to call this image, and I'll set this attribute to be an image. I'll choose to create that. And now for every single category within my list here, I can actually select this modify attributes field, and I can upload a custom image to this particular category. And of course, the custom image I'd like to upload is going to be the relevant icon to the real world Airbnb product. And if you'd like to actually just be able to save this image instead of having to create your own, you can just right click on this and choose to save the image as. Now I've already gone ahead and I've saved those to my local device. So what I'm going to do is jump back into Bubble and I'm going to upload an image to my lakefront. And what you'll see is that I've uploaded the icon image here, so I can choose to save that. I'm then going to head to my beaches category and I'll choose to modify its attributes. I'll then upload my icon to this particular option. I can then choose to save this. I'll then do the exact same thing for my cabins. So I'll select to modify my attributes. I will upload the custom icon. And then once I've uploaded that, I can choose to save this field. And once again, I'm not going to bore you to death by making you watch me add all of these images in. So I'm just going to skip ahead and add those in myself. But as I had mentioned, feel free to save those images from the real world Airbnb product and then upload those within your image field. Okay, so I've just gone ahead and uploaded my images. And now because we've taken the time to pre-create a list of option sets within our database, this data is going to be permanently stored within our Bubble application today. So whenever I want to recreate the Airbnb homepage, which we are going to do later, and if I want to display a list of categories across the top of my page, I can easily just reference all of the categories stored within this option set list because I've already taken the time to create them. And as I mentioned, this list isn't going to change. It's only going to ever store these values that I add into it. And so because it's not a data type, we don't need to then go through and create those in our application. These have in fact already been created. So this is why option sets are known as what's called static values, because they're not going to change. Now that's just one option set list I've added into my application today. And I do apologize if you are relatively new to Bubble, and this seems like a massive sidestep from where we were just a couple minutes ago when we were adding data types into our database. And don't worry, we are going to come back to our data types, but I'm going to add in the rest of my option set lists first, just because within each data type, I'd like to link those to my option sets. So for example, for every property that's created, I'm obviously going to want to store what category it belongs to. So before I build out the data fields, which houses all of the information for a property, I'm going to need to create my option sets. So that way I can link it to that option set. But enough on that right now. I will come back to that and explain that in detail. I just want to jump back into Notion though, and just highlight the additional option sets that I want to create today. So there was one option set here called account type. So whenever a user registers an account, I'd like them to either be a host or a guest. And so if I create an option set in my database today, I can determine which two account types a user can be. So again, either a host or a guest. So this is a relatively straightforward option set to add in. So I'm going to jump to my Bubble editor, and within my data tab, I'm going to head to my option set list, and I'm going to add a new option set called account type. I'll create this. Now within this option set, it's relatively straightforward. I'm just going to add two options, one as a host and one as a guest. And for this list of options, I'm only going to want to store these text values. I don't need to add any additional attributes because I just need to determine a text value of what someone's account type is going to be. And of course, the reason why I've selected this as an option set is because I don't want users being able to determine what account type they're going to be. If it was up to users, I mean, everyone would think that they're a superhost, or heck, they'd probably even say that they should be an admin of your application. So what I want to do is create a way that we can control what type of account access people will have. Jumping back into Notion though, I can see I have two additional option set lists. One is going to be for my property type. So every single time someone creates a property, I want to determine the list of types that they can choose from for that property. So is the property an apartment? Is it a house? Is it a self-contained storage? And once again, I want to be the person who controls what type of properties they can choose from, because I'm sure every user thinks that their property would be a palace, when in fact it's probably just a studio apartment in downtown New York. So we're going to jump back into Bubble and we're going to create another option set called property type. And then I'm just going to add in the list of property types that I just ran through. So the first one was an apartment. The next will be a house. Then there was self-contained storage. And then finally there was one called unique space. And now for this option set list, when it comes to the attributes, I would also like to add in an image attribute once again. And the reason I'd like to do that is because I'm just going to show you a real world example in a separate tab here of the process Airbnb uses to create a property. So this is the real world Airbnb product. And you'll see when I go to create a property listing, it's going to ask me what type of place I would like to host. And this is where it's going to display my property type list. And what you'll see here is that it not only contains a text value, which is the name of that property type, but it also includes a little image here on the right-hand side. And so what I'm going to do is choose to right-click on this image and once again, save that. And then I'm going to jump into Bubble. I'm going to create a new attribute within my property type option set list. And this attribute will be called image. And I will of course set that to be an image. I'll choose to create this. And now for each property type, I can choose to once again modify my attributes and I can upload the relevant image from the relevant category here. Now, of course, I've gone ahead and I've already saved these to my local device. So I'm just going to jump into Bubble and upload the image from my computer. So I have my apartment image there. I'll save this. I'll then go to my house option. I will modify its attributes. I will upload the image I've saved. Then I can save this. And look, you get the idea. So I'm just going to quickly go ahead and upload all of the images. And I'd recommend pausing the tutorial so you can do the same. Alrighty, now that I'm back, that is everything I want to add for my property type option sets. There is, of course, one last option set list I'd like to factor in, and that is going to be what's known as the property space. So within Airbnb's listing process, once you've selected what type of property you have and select the next option, it's going to ask you what type of space guests will have at your particular property. And so we can see we have these three options here. So is it an entire place? Is it a private room or even a shared room? And of course, I want to be the only person who controls what type of options our users can choose from today. So that's why I'm adding these as a list of option sets. And I can see here that we only need to add in a text attribute. We don't have an image here. So I'm going to jump into my Bubble editor and I'm going to create one last option set list called property space. And then for the options, I'm just going to add in all of the options from this list here. So back in Bubble, I'm going to say it's either an entire place. I'll create that. It could be a private room or even a shared room. And as I mentioned, I won't need to add any image attribute here. It's just going to be my text fields. And that concludes everything I wanted to add for my option set list. So now we can actually take a step back and head back to our initial data types. And you'll see why I had to take a side step over to my option sets in a moment. But what I'd like to now do is build out all of the data fields within each data type. So this is where I'm going to determine what information I want to store for every entry created in our database. So for every user account that has been created, I'm going to want to store things like the person's name, their bio, a profile photo, their account type, as well as a list of saved properties. And so if I jump over into Bubble here, I'm going to head back to my data types tab, and I'm going to open up my user data type. And now on the right hand side, you'll see that we have the ability to create data fields. So I'm going to choose to create this here. And the first data field I'd like to create, so the first bit of information I want to store within someone's account is going to be their name. And now you'll see here from the list of options, we can determine what type of data this should be structured as in our database. And in this case, I just want someone's name to be a basic text field. I can choose to create that. Then for every user account, I'd like to also store a bio. So this could be like a description or an about me section for this user's profile. And this field type is also going to be a text type. It's relatively straightforward. I'd also like to create another field and have this be the profile photo. And one thing you may notice here is that when I'm creating a data field, and if it's split into two words, I don't actually add a space between these words. I simply just add a dash. And the reason I do that is because it then allows me to easily differentiate between my data fields and my data types. So my data types will never have a dash. They'll always have a space between two words. Whereas my data fields will always have a dash between the words. So that way when I'm then accessing my data fields in my bubble editor, I can easily identify what is a data field because it has a dash between the two words. For this data field though, I'm going to set the type to be an image because of course this is going to be a picture. I'll choose to create this. Then for a user, whenever they create an account, I'd like to identify what their account type is going to be. So are they a host or are they a guest? So I'm going to create a field here and I'm going to call this account type. And now instead of allowing a user to type in whatever type of account they'd like to be, I'm going to allow them to select from our predetermined list of option sets, which of course includes our two options. And so this is why I had to go out and build my option set list first, because I actually want this data field to link to that option set list. So for this field type here, I'm going to open up my drop-down menu and scroll on down to the bottom. And you'll see that I'm able to access my pre-built option set list that I've already created. And so I'm going to select that this field type should be my account type option set list, which means that someone can only select from either a host or a guest because they were the only two options added into that option set. I'll then choose to create that. And then finally, the very last field I'd like to create is going to be a list of saved properties. So if someone wants to, let's say, bookmark a property and view it later, I'm going to allow them to save that as a list to their account. And so for this field type here, I'm going to actually link this to my property data type. So within my list, I can select from the property. And because I want to allow someone to bookmark more than one property at a time, I'm going to select this option to make this a list with multiple entries. So then someone will be able to add as many properties as they would like into this list. And this is where you can really start to see the power of Bubble's database feature come into play. You of course have the ability to make connections and link all of your different data types together, which creates what's known as a fully relational database, which essentially just in simple terms means that all of your information can talk to each other. So if, for instance, I ever want to access and display a list of all of the properties saved within someone's account, I can easily do that. And that's what separates Bubble from most no-code tools. It's that Bubble really does have the complexity to build truly amazing features like this. But of course, because it is more complex, it does take a little bit longer to comprehend. But that's what I'm here to help with today. So we're going to choose to create this data field here. And now that's actually all of the data fields I'd like to add within our user data type. But before we go and check all of those off in my Notion checklist, one thing I'd just like to point out is that under my account type data field, because I've predetermined a list of the two options that someone can select from, you'll see here that we have the ability to determine what type of account someone should be by default. And in this case today, I'd like someone to be a guest by default. So whenever someone signs up for an account, I would like to automatically make them a guest, which means that they can view through a list of properties and book those if they would like. However, later on, when someone upgrades to become a host, I'm going to switch this value across to then allow them to be a host, which will give them access to features like creating listings. And you'll also see that this is the power of using option sets. It allows me to just set a predetermined value for someone's account. But that's everything I want to change here. So let's jump back over into our Notion checklist. I'm going to highlight all of the data fields within my user data type and tick those off. And then we can move on down to our property data type. And look, this is where most of the information is going to be stored today. So for every property that's listed on our platform, there is quite a bit of information we'll need to store for it. So let's just jump into Bubble and I can walk you through all of those data fields. So in my database, I'm going to head over to my property data type. And I'm going to choose to create our first field. And the first field is just going to be simple. It's going to be the name of the property. And I'd like that to be a text field. It's nice and straightforward. Then the next field will be similar. It's just going to be the description of this property. So this can be like the about section of the property that we can display on a property page. I'll set this field type to also be a text field. Once again, it's very straightforward. Then I would like to store the address for this property. So I'm going to type in a field called address. Now for this field type, I'm going to link this to a geographic address. And thankfully today, I'm going to explain how we can integrate our application with Google Maps. So that way we can pull from a list of real world addresses and also display where those properties are located on a map. And so in order to achieve that, we're going to need to set this field as a geographic address. We can then create that. Then the next field I'd like to add is going to be the cost of this property. So what is the price per night to stay at this property? And so I'm going to create a field here, and I'm just going to abbreviate this to be called PPN. So that is price per night. Now for this field, I'd like this to be a number because it's going to be a dollar amount, and we can format that as a currency later on, which of course I'll show you how to do that. But for now, I'm going to select that this field type should be a number. I can then choose to create this. Then for every property, I'd also like to know how many adults and children it can sleep. So I'm going to create a field here called adult count. And I'd like this field type to once again be a number because any property could store 1, 2, 3, or even 10 adults if it really wanted. I will create that. Then I'd also like to add a similar field, in this case though, called children count. So how many children can this property accommodate for? And this field type will once again be a number. I'll create that. Then I'd also like to determine how many bedrooms and bathrooms this property has. So I'm going to add yet another field. And this field is going to be called bedroom count. I will set this field type to once again be a number. I'll create that. And then the next field will be called bathroom count. And as you probably guessed, this is also going to be a number. So I will create that as well. And I apologize if I just zipped through all of those fields, but they are pretty much the exact same. Next though, I'd like to add in a list of amenities that a property can offer. So within my Notion checklist, you'll see that I've just added a small list of amenities here. So does the property have a kitchen? Does it offer air conditioning, a washing machine, or even Wi-Fi? Now I've just kept the example of my amenities very minimum for our tutorial today, but of course you can add in as many different amenities as you would like. So I'm going to start by adding a data field within my property data type. And I'm going to call this kitchen. Now for this field type, I would actually like this to be a yes/no value because a property is either going to offer a kitchen or they're not. So I'm going to select this and I'll create that. And then later on, whenever someone ticks a checkbox to say that they do offer a kitchen or they don't, I can store the value of that in our database. And now from here, I'm going to create pretty much the exact same thing, but for my different list of amenities. So for the next one, I'm going to create a new field and call this AC. So this is obviously air conditioner. This field type will also be a yes/no value because a property either will have air conditioner or it won't. I will create that. I will create another field and call this washing machine because a property can either offer one or they don't, which means that this field type will be a yes/no value. And so I'm going to create this field. And then the last amenity I just want to add in for my example today is just going to be Wi-Fi. I'll set this field type to be yes/no, and I will also create that. Now, as I mentioned, these are just 4 amenities. Of course, you could offer as many as you would like. So if you did want to add more in, I'd recommend just pausing this tutorial here and adding in a list of any additional amenities you wanted to offer. And of course, you can just set the field type to be a yes/no option. From here though, back in my Notion checklist, I can see that we're just going to need to store some additional information about the property type as well as the property space. And both of these fields are going to be linked to our option sets that we've previously created. So if I jump back into a bubble here, I'm going to create a field and I'm going to call this property type. So this will determine if the apartment is something like an apartment, a house, or even a unique space. And because I've already determined our list of property types that someone can select from, I'm going to set the field type here to be a property type, which is linked to our option set list. I will create this. And now I'm not going to add a default value on this field just because I want someone to determine what their own property type is. But of course, they'll only be able to select from our predetermined list. They're not going to be able to create their own. I will then create another data field, and this is going to be called property space. And once again, this field is going to be linked to our option set list we've already created. So I'm going to select from the property space option set. I will choose to create that. Now, another field I'd like to create that's going to be linked to my option set is the categories. And so I'd like to allow someone to select what categories are relevant to their property that they'd like to list. So if I scroll on down, I'm going to add another field, and I'm going to call this categories. Now, of course, I'm going to link this field to my categories option set list. But one thing I should point out is that I'd like to make this field a list with multiple entries, because someone should be able to select more than one category for a property, because a property might offer, let's say, a nice view, it might be an OMG property, and it might even have a bed and breakfast. So they're 3 different categories that are relevant to the one property. So I'm actually going to tick that this field should be a list with multiple entries. So that way a host can determine which list of properties best suits their listing. I'll choose to create this. And then finally, the very last field I want to add within my property data type is a way to link each property to a list of property images. Now, as I'd mentioned before, when it comes to the images of a property, I don't want to store these directly in my property data type, because as you can see, we are already loading quite a bit of data, although all of these options are going to be quite small bits of data, so it's not going to immediately slow our application down. But if I was to start storing, let's say, up to 10 high definition images on each property, what you'll find is that when you go to load a list of properties, Bubble actually loads every single data field within each property listing. So even if you're not displaying that information, it is going to still load it. And so that becomes a problem if, let's say, on your homepage, you don't want to display all of the images for a property, but you have all of your images saved within your property data type. Bubble's immediately going to load all of the images within each property, even if you only wanted to display just one. And so that's why today I've created a separate data type called our property images. So for every property that's created, I'm also going to create a list of images, but of course I'm going to need a way to link these 2 data types together. And so what I can do within my property data type is scroll on down and create a field here, and I'm going to call this field images, and I'm going to link this field type to our separate data type, which is known as our property images. And within that data type, I'm going to store a list of images. So I don't need to tick that this is a list here. I'm going to take care of that on my second data type. I am going to create this for now. And instead of storing a list of 10 images under one property, this new data field here is only going to store a linked value to our separate data type. So it's not going to actually save any image files in this data type. It's just going to save almost like a unique ID that will determine which list of images it should link to, from which, because these 2 data types are connected, if I do ever want to display the images for this property, I can easily reference those by just identifying what images this is linked to. And look, I know that might sound completely overwhelming if you are relatively new to Bubble, and don't worry, this is more of an advanced thing to do, but I just wanted to make sure I took the time to explain things properly from the beginning, so that way you don't run into any issues later on down the track. And as I mentioned at the start of this tutorial today, when it comes to creating a database, you're more than likely not going to get it right the first time around. It takes lots of practice having built different applications to really understand how things are going to be structured and what is the best way to do that. But from here, that's all of the data fields I wanted to add into our property data type. It was definitely one of the bigger data types we needed to build out today. So from here, I'm going to jump back into Notion. I'm going to check off all of those data fields, and then I'm going to move on down to my property images data type. Now this one is super simple. So if I jump into Bubble and open up my property images, all I'd like to store in this is just a list of images. So I'm going to create a field. I will call this images, and I will set the field type to be an image, but I'd also like to tick that this should be a list with multiple entries, because I'd like to store multiple images within this. And now, because we created the link to this separate data type within our initial property data type, I don't need to worry about linking this back right now. So that connection has already been made. So I'm going to jump back into Notion, check off my property images data type, and then scroll on down to my booking. So every single time someone creates a booking or a reservation in our application today, I'd like to store some key information about that. So if we jump into Bubble here, I'm going to open up our booking data type. And the very first field I'd like to store is just going to be the number of adults staying at this booking. So I'm going to call this field adults. I'm going to set this field type to be a number because I'm going to determine how many adults are staying within this particular reservation. I'll create this. Then I'd like to store the number of children. So I'm going to create another data field called children. And I'll once again set this field type to be a number. Now I should just point out that if someone has no children staying at their property, this number would just be 0 in our database. So I'm going to choose to create this here. Then for every booking, I would just like to identify what dates someone has made this reservation for. So I'm going to create a field and I'm going to call this booking dates. And for this field type, I'd like this to not just be a date, but instead a date range. So a date range is going to allow me to determine what the start and finish date is for this booking. It's nice and simple. I'm going to choose to create that. Then for every booking, I'd also like to identify what property has been booked. So if someone books a particular property, I'm obviously going to want to store that information in our overall booking. So I'm going to create a field here and I'm going to call this the property field. And as you might have guessed by now, I'm going to want to link this to my property data type. So if I scroll down my list of fields, I'm going to select my property data type. And because only one booking will link to one property at a time, I will not be selecting that should be a list with multiple entries. I'll choose to create this here. And then the final field I'd like to add is just going to be the total price of this booking. So that's going to be how much the property is per night multiplied by how many nights someone is staying at this property. And this field type is just going to be a number. I can create that there. Then we can jump back into Notion, check off all of those data fields, and the very last list of data fields I'd like to add in is going to be within our review data type. So every single time someone creates a review, I'm obviously going to need to store some information about that review. So I'm going to jump into Bubble. I'll head to our review data type. And the first thing I'd like to store within a review is just the actual content of the review itself. So this is, I guess you could say, the message or the text that someone types within a review. So I'm just going to create a field and call this content. I will set this field type to be a text value. It's nice and simple. Then for every review, I'd also like someone to add a star rating. So I'm going to create another field and call this rating. Now this field type is going to be a number because someone's going to be able to select a number from 1 to 5. And so we can easily just create that. I'd also like to link every review to the host of the property that someone stayed at. So I'm going to create a field here and I'm going to call this the host. And the reason I'm creating this is because later on, if I would like to display a list of all of the reviews that a host has received, I can easily just identify all of the reviews that are linked to one person. And so because a host is in fact a person who has an account, this field type will be linked to our user data type. I'll choose to create that. And then finally, I'd also like to link each review to a property that someone stayed at. So I'm going to create another field and I'm going to call this the original property that this review should be linked to. So just to abbreviate that, I'm going to call that OG property. And this field type will, of course, be linked to my property data type. I will then create that. Now, that's everything we'll need to add within this data type. I'm going to jump back into Notion and tick off all of those data fields. And that actually concludes everything we'll need to build out for our database here. As I mentioned, this database was absolutely huge in comparison to some of my other tutorials. So please don't be alarmed if this was overwhelming for you. If you are relatively new to Bubble, I'd always recommend trying to watch over this again more than once, just so that way you get a really good understanding as to all of the key concept I explained while I walked us through this process. Not only did I talk about how we could add in the different data types and fields, but I threw option sets into that, which to be honest, I didn't even use in Bubble until 6 months in. So they are a bit more of an advanced feature. And then I even explained how we could separate our data types to make sure our app maintains its scalability. But aside from those key concepts, which might be a little hard to grasp the first time around, it's actually crazy to think that you can create a custom database like this without writing a single line of code using Bubble's tool. And now from here, I'm super excited to dive into the process of actually building out our application because we've now set up the necessary framework to make everything else possible. After setting up our database, we can move along down to the list of features I have laid out for us in our build today. And now, as I'd shown you, this is quite an extensive list. It's by far one of the biggest builds I've created in any tutorial so far to date. And so there's plenty I need to cover within our video today. And the very first thing I want to cover is just getting straight into the process of actually building out the core homepage of our Airbnb product. And so if you're familiar with the real world Airbnb product itself, you'll know that on the homepage, there is actually quite a bit happening, although it looks quite visually enticing and minimal. What we have at the top is this home/navigation bar, which allows someone to perform a search for any properties, as well as access all of their account settings. Then we have this list of all of the categories that you can filter Airbnbs by. And then finally, below this, we have a list of all of the Airbnb properties itself. And now while this doesn't look like much, it actually does take quite a lot to build the exact same clean experience within our Bubble app. And of course, as I walk you through all the steps involved in creating this homepage, our version of the app is going to be fully responsive regardless of whatever device a user is accessing our product through. So whether that be a desktop or a mobile, it's going to be responsive on both. And so the very first thing I want to cover is how we can rebuild this header section of our app. And as I mentioned, there is quite a little bit involved within this. And one thing I should point out is that regardless of whatever page we view on our Airbnb clone, this menu is actually going to be displayed on every single page. And so within our Bubble editor on our index page, which is known as our home page, what we could do is of course create and add this header menu to this page. But because we're going to be reusing this exact same header menu across every single page in our application today, what I want to do is actually create this as what's known as a reusable element. And so straight away here, I'm definitely getting into some of the more intermediate features within Bubble. But essentially, a reusable element does exactly what the name would suggest. It allows you to create an element once and then reuse that across multiple pages or places within your app at any given time. So what we could do is create that header menu as a reusable element once, and then on every single page that we create in our application, we could easily just paste that reusable element in. And that's going to save us having to redesign this on every single page, as well as rebuild all of the workflows that make it functional. And so before I even touch this page on our index page that already exists in our Bubble editor, I'm actually going to open up our page drop-down menu, and you'll see the option to add in a reusable element here. And if I was to click on this, it's going to ask us to create a new reusable element. And in this case, I'm just going to call this my header menu. I'll choose to create this from scratch. And now what it's going to do is redirect us through to this dedicated, almost like a page editor. And this is where we can create our reusable element. And if you ever want to refer back to this reusable element, you can just open up your page drop-down menu, and it's not going to sit within your page menu. Instead, it's going to sit down below here in our reusable elements menu. So you can see here that we have opened up our header menu. And now if I was to double click on our reusable element here, it's going to open up our property editor. And what you'll see is that we can choose which type of element this should be. And I know that we haven't actually taken the time to learn the difference between elements, but essentially what we're going to do here is just use the default group option. So this just means that we're going to group a bunch of different elements together inside of this reusable element. So if we were to look at the Airbnb header menu that they have, I can see in this overall group section at the top of our page, we have an Airbnb logo, we have this custom search bar, as well as some of the navigation buttons here. And so this group element is the exact type of element we'll need to leverage here. But before I start adding any elements into this group, I'm going to need to jump over to my layout tab here. And what this is going to allow me to do is customize the size and dimensions of this particular group. But what it's also going to do is allow me to determine in which order the elements inside of this will be placed. And this setting is actually known as the container layout. And within Bubble, if you're ever creating a new page or you're using a group element similar to what I'm doing here today, you will be required to select a container layout, which, as I mentioned, just determines the position and order in which elements will be placed within either a group or a page. And when it comes to the container layout options, I'll often only select either one of the two options at the bottom here, so the row or the column. The difference between these two options is that if you want to position elements horizontally within your group, so if you want to position these elements side by side, you need to select the row option. Whereas if you wanted to stack elements on top of each other, you would select them to be a column. And now if we were to look at the real world Airbnb website once again, you'll see that all of these elements are in fact positioned horizontally within our group because they're positioned side by side, not on top of each other. So that means in this case, I'm going to select the row option. And now just as a side note, I rarely ever select the align to parent or the fixed option. I'll often only choose between these two here. So I'm going to select the row option. And now you'll see that we have this extended menu here, which allows us to update the dimensions of our group. And while we're working on this group, I'm just going to update the size here to be 960 pixels. And the reason I've selected 960 is just because that gives us some additional space to work with. Of course, within this experience, I'm going to explain how we can make this fully responsive on any device. So if a user is viewing this on a large desktop, it'll stretch out. And if they're viewing this on a mobile, it will contract in. But for the time being, I'm just going to leave that at 960 pixels. I'm also going to leave the height here at 200 pixels. However, I will be coming back later on to update that. But what we can do now is start to add in all of the elements we'd like to display within our header menu. And the very first thing, as I mentioned, is just going to be the Airbnb logo. So if I head to my visual elements here, I'm just going to scroll on down and select to add an image element into my overall group. And what I'm going to do is just upload a static image that I have stored on my local device here. And so that's just going to be an Airbnb logo. And once I've uploaded my image, you can see that my layout is quite disproportional here. So what I'm going to do is jump over to my layout tab. And this is where I can start to customize the design settings of this particular element. And so in this case, what I'm going to do is choose to update the width of this element to be 150 pixels. I'm also going to tick this option to keep this element's aspect ratio fixed. And I'm going to set the aspect ratio as 3:1. So now you'll see that the logo is going to be these dimensions. And now one thing I should also point out is that with my width setting here, I've selected that this should be a fixed width, which just means that this image element is always going to be 150 pixels in width, regardless of the page size. So let's say if the page was to increase with size or even shrink, it's always going to remain this size, which is 150 pixels wide. The only other thing I'm going to change while I'm working on this element is that I'm going to update the vertical alignment. So this is just going to determine where within our group this image element is going to sit. So I'm going to set the vertical alignment to be centered, which means that this element will always sit in the center of our overall header menu. And then finally, the last thing I'm going to do is add in some margin to the left-hand side of this particular element. So if I was to scroll on down to my margin settings here and add in 20 pixels of margin, what you'll see is that there's going to be 20 pixels of space between this element and the border of my overall group. And now that's how we can add in our image element, which is actually one of the most straightforward things we're going to do within this section of our tutorial. The next element, however, is just going to be a little bit more tedious to work around. So if I open up the Airbnb application here, what you'll see is that we have almost like this custom search experience. And now if I was to look at this section here, the way I visualize this is that this curved shape here is what's known as a group. And within that group, it has 3 different text elements as well as a button element. And so what you'll see here is that we're going to start stacking elements in groups within our Bubble application. And so if I jump over into Bubble once again, within our existing group here, which is going to house these 3 elements, what we'll need to do is create another group inside of that, which is going to house these additional elements. So I'm going to open up my Bubble editor here. I'm going to scroll on down to my containers menu and I'm going to add in a group element. And now when it comes to this group, the first thing I'm going to do is update the name of this. So that way later on, when I create some workflows to make my app functional, I know which group to reference whenever I want to create some sort of event. So I'm going to click in this field here. I'm just going to remove the letter A. I'm going to call this group search bar. Then from here, I'm going to jump to my appearance tab. And I'm going to remove the style of this group. And now this is just a personal preference I have. And if you're relatively new to Bubble, I definitely recommend doing this yourself. What I like to do when I work with groups is I like to set the background style to be a flat color. And then I like to just make these a different shade of a light color. So in this case, I'm just going to make this a light shade of red here. I could even make that slightly lighter if I would like. I don't need it to be too visible. But the reason I'm doing this is because if you're anything like me, I'm a very visual person when it comes to learning and building. And so what I like to do is actually see where elements will lie on my page. And of course, when you go to publish your application or even preview it, you can just remove the color of this. But for the time being, I'm just going to leave this as a flat color. It kind of reminds me of how you can build with Lego blocks and see everything being pieced together. That's why I just like to leave a color on my groups. When it comes to the appearance of this group, I'm also going to update the roundness of its borders to be 100, which is going to make these curved, as you'll see. And then finally, I'm just going to set the shadow style to be an outset, so that way it has some shadow around all of the borders of this element. I'm then going to jump over into my layout tab here, because I'll now need to update the design settings. So in terms of the design settings and how much room this is going to take on my page. But before I can do that, I'm of course going to need to once again select the container layout for this group. So this of course will determine in which order or which position elements are going to sit inside of this group. And now if I was to once again look at the real world Airbnb product here, I can see that there's a couple of different elements. So as I mentioned, the 3 text elements and the button here, all of these elements are positioned horizontally. So that means they're positioned side by side. And that of course means that my container layout is going to need to be a row. I will select that. And now after selecting my container layout, what I can do is choose to just update the responsive settings or even just the width settings of this particular group. So at this point in time, this group here is set to be 400 pixels in width. And because it has a fixed value, that means it's always going to be 400 pixels. Now, if I was to open up my responsive tab here, this just allows me to see how my application is going to behave on any particular device size. And of course, these numbers here are just the count of how many pixels are going to be displayed across each device. Now, if I was to drag this down, what you'll see is that because our group has a fixed width of 400 pixels, it's always going to want to be 400 pixels. So that just means it's going to get cut off because essentially right now this group here is being quite stubborn. It only wants to be 400 pixels. Whereas what I'd like to do is have this shrink in size. So what I could do is unselect that this should be a fixed width, and I could set the minimum width to be 0. And that just means that it's going to continually shrink down regardless of the size of the page. However, because this group has a maximum width of infinite, this also means it's going to scale across our page and take up as much as it wants. So now this group just went from being stubborn to just being plain greedy. And look, I'm not all about that. So what I'm going to do is add a maximum width here. And I actually quite liked the width of 400 pixels that we had on our group before. So if I add a maximum width of 400 pixels here, that's just going to tell this group that it is allowed to go as small as it wants down to 0 pixels, but it's not allowed to go any wider than 400 pixels. So now what you'll find is that if I reduce the width of my page, this is going to shrink and contract. However, if I allow it to expand all the way out, it's not going to go past 400 pixels. And now when it comes to the height and the margin, I'll update that in a moment. But the first thing I'd like to do is just add in all of my elements into this group. So these are essentially the 3 text elements as well as the button here. So I'm going to jump back into my Bubble editor. I'll open up my UI builder, which will allow me to design my app. And what I'm going to now do is add in my 3 text elements first. But one thing I should point out before I do that, and again, this is just going to add in yet another layer of complexity, so I do apologize in advance, But if we were to open up Airbnb's product here, what you'll see is that this group actually has no purpose in terms of the fact that someone doesn't actually choose where they want to visit within this menu. This group here just acts as almost like a placeholder until someone clicks on this. So if I was to click on this here, what you'll find is that this expanded menu opens. And so as I mentioned, that group itself was almost like just a little dummy group. So it's just there until someone actually selects on all of the input fields that they want to choose from. And so today, what I'm going to do is create an experience that just displays these 3 text elements next to a button. And whenever someone clicks on this group, I'd like to remove these 3 text elements and instead display a series of input fields. However, one thing I'd like to do is keep this little search button here, because you'll notice that that remains quite consistent. Of course, it just displays the word search. And that's definitely a feature we can create today. But because I want to hide and display these 3 text elements together, I'm actually going to probably just confuse the hell out of you here, but add another group within my existing group. So you can kind of see how we're creating one of those little Russian dolls where there's just layers upon layers. And that is the way to create a fully functional and responsive app within Bubble. So if I was to open up my Bubble editor here, within our red group, I'm going to add yet another group. And at this point in time, because this group is clear, you won't be able to see it within our existing red group. So what I'm going to do is jump to my Appearance tab. Like I did before, I'm going to remove the style of this. I'm going to update the background style to be a flat color. And I'm going to select this flat color just to be a light shade of green, so that way it stands out on my page. I might even make it just a little bit darker there. And now I don't need to customize the roundness of the borders or even the shadow style of this group. This is just going to serve as a purpose to hold my 3 text elements together. So what I'm going to do is just quickly jump to my layout tab. And because I want to display my 3 text elements side by side, I'm going to update the container layout to be a row. And then finally, I'm going to update the width settings of this group. So I'm going to unselect that this should be a fixed width. Like I did before, I'm going to set the minimum width to 0, which just means that it can collapse to the smallest possible size on our page. However, in this instance, I am in fact going to keep the maximum width as infinite. And because our green group actually sits within that red group, you may remember that that red group had a maximum width of 400. So this green group can actually be no larger than 400 pixels because that is the size of the group it sits within. Now, this group's going to make a lot more sense when I finish adding my text elements in and remove the additional height I have here. So what we're going to do is start by adding our text elements in here. And for this element, I'm going to have this display the word anywhere. I'll then choose to just remove the style of this because I'd like to bold this text. I'm also then just going to center align this so that way the text is in the center of the element itself. And then from here, I'm going to jump to my layout tab because I'd like to update the responsive settings of this particular text element. And now when it comes to working with text elements, what I like to do is unselect that these should be a fixed width. And I'll always personally set the minimum width as 0, leaving the maximum width as infinite. And throughout our tutorial today, that's a common feature you're going to see me use. So this essentially just means that regardless of the page's size, whether it be as small as 0 or as large as, let's say, 1200, 1500 pixels, this text element is going to be fully responsive. So it knows that it can either contract or expand as much as it is allowed to. And then from here, I'm also going to update the height of this element. So if I set the minimum height as 0, it's just going to collapse around the text quite nicely there. And what you also might just see is that because this text is quite small, we have all of this empty space on either side of it. So what I'm also going to do is for our width settings, I'm just going to tick this option to fit the width of this element to the content within it, which just means that it's going to collapse nicely around the text inside of it there. And then finally, I'm going to vertically align this text element in the center of my green group. So that way it's always positioned in the center in line with our logo. And then from there, I'm also going to add in 10 pixels of margin at the top and 10 pixels of margin on the bottom. So that way later, when I close off all of this empty space in our green group, the group border itself doesn't touch the text inside of it. From here, I'm going to click on this text element, make a copy of it, then click on my green group, paste in the copy there. And similar to the real world Airbnb product, I'm going to have this text display the words any week. And because I've copied this element across, I won't need to update all of its layout settings. All of those have been copied across. I'm then going to make another copy of this. And in this case, this is going to display the word add guess. However, I don't want this text to be in bold formatting. So I'm going to unselect this here. And that is all of the 3 text elements I'd like to add within this green group. So what I'm actually going to do is now select on my overall green group. I'm going to head to my layout tab once again. And I'd like to first of all just remove all of the excess height between my elements and the borders. So if I was to head on down to my minimum height and set that to be 0, what you'll see is that it's going to collapse around all of our elements. And because we have 10 pixels of margin around each text element, it's going to ensure it doesn't touch the actual text itself. What I'm then going to do is select on my green group. I'm also going to vertically align this in the center of my red group. So that way, once again, it is in fact in line with all of my additional elements here. And then finally, I'm going to need to update the positioning for the way in which this text is structured horizontally within my green group. So under our container layout, you'll see an option called container alignment here. This essentially just determines where all of the elements that sit within this group are going to be positioned. So at the moment, they're all positioned to the left, whereas if I wanted to position these in the center, I could do that. But what I'd actually like to do today is select this option here called space around. And what that's going to do is just ensure that there's an even amount of space around each element within this group. And that's also going to make it fully responsive. So if I was to reduce the width of my page here, you'll see that it's always going to need to add an even amount of spacing around our text elements. So that's how we can start to create that responsive experience. From here, of course, I'm going to need to add in one last element into our red group. And that is going to be this button element here with the little search glass inside of it. And now in Bubble, there's 2 ways you can create a button. The first is by selecting the actual button element itself. However, if you've ever used Bubble in the past, you may not have, that's completely okay. One thing you'll know is that you can't actually add icon elements into a button. You can only add text. And so that leads me to the second alternative when it comes to creating buttons. You can, of course, as you probably guessed, create another group, and you can have that function like a button. And so because I've spammed you with so many groups already, I'm going to continue walking down that path. So if I was to head to my containers menu, I'm going to add a group element into my existing red group here. And when it comes to this group, because we haven't updated any of its formatting, it's going to break the current formatting of our existing group. But the first thing I'd like to do is jump over into my appearance tab. And for this group, I'm going to remove the style of this, because what I'd like to do is once again set the background style to be a flat color. Only this time I am going to post in a specific color code. So this is going to be a pink color code, which is the same pink Airbnb uses. If you'd like this color code, it's FF5A5F. I'm then going to set the roundness of this group to be 100. So that way when I reduce the size of it, it's going to be a perfect circle. From here, I'm going to jump over into my layout tab. And when it comes to the container layout, because I'm only going to add one element into this group, I can select either the row or column. There's no correct or wrong option. I am just going to select the row just because that's my personal preference. And before I update any of the container alignment or anything like that, the first thing I want to do is just update the height and width for this group. So I'm going to set the width to be 40 pixels. And I'm going to leave this as a fixed value, because I'd also like to set the height here to be 40 pixels as well as a fixed value, which is just going to ensure that regardless of the page size, this group is always going to be 40 pixels by 40 pixels. I can then, of course, vertically align this in the center of my existing red group here. I'm going to then add some margin around this element. So I'm going to add in 10 pixels of margin at the top, 10 on the bottom, as well as then 10 on the right hand side. So that way it's not touching the border of my existing red group. While I'm here, I'm also just going to quickly divert and click on my green group. And I'm just going to add in 10 pixels of margin on the left hand side here. So that way it's not touching the border of my red group. Then I'm just going to jump back to my existing pink circle group here. And so at this point in time, we've added the group and I'm quite happy with how it's structured. However, of course, I'm going to need to add in the little magnifying glass, which is the search icon. So if I was to scroll on up to my visual elements, I can select to add an icon element into my group. And although this looks like it's larger than my group, it does currently sit inside of that. And I'm just going to type in the word search. I'll select the magnifying glass here. When it comes to the style of this, I'm just going to remove the style because I'm going to want to update the color just to be white. I'm then going to jump to my layout tab because I'll need to update the size of this. And in this case, I'm going to set the width to be 20 pixels and the height to be 20 pixels. And I'm going to keep these as fixed values because I'm only ever going to want it to be 20 by 20. Then I'm going to vertically align this element in the center of my red group. But of course, as you can see, it's currently positioned to the left-hand side. And that is because if I click on my overall pink/red group here, what you'll find is that the container alignment is set to be the left, whereas what I'd like to do is align that in the center. And look, that is everything I'm going to add within this overall red group here. I know it definitely seems like a lot of work just to create a small element. However, this is going to help us create that fully responsive experience we want today. And as I mentioned, if you're trying to build an app in Bubble, what you will find is essentially you're going to have to stack multiple different groups in order to create the experiences you want. And so from here, I'm going to select on my overall red group. And because I've finished adding all of my elements inside of this, what I'd like to do is update the height here to be 0. And it's going to collapse nicely around all of my elements there. And this is where it's finally going to start to take the shape of the search bar experience similar to Airbnb. And while we're working in this group, I'd like to vertically align this in the center of my overall white group here. And I also just want to update its container alignment to that space around option. So that way, if this ever expands or contracts, there's going to be an even amount of space around all of the elements inside of it there. And it's only at this point that you can really start to see our header menu coming together nicely. The very last thing I want to add in is just going to be almost like this little group here where it has a user's profile photo as well as the hamburger menu. And if you currently aren't logged into an account, this will display the words become a host. And so I'm just going to create my own group that will display 3 of those icons next to each other. And as you probably guessed, as I just said, I'm going to use yet another group to group those 3 elements together. So I'm going to jump into Bubble once again. I'm going to scroll to my containers menu and I'll be adding a group element into my existing white group. And when it comes to this group here, the first thing I'm going to do is just update the name of this to be called account menu, because this is where someone's going to be able to access all of their account details. I'm then going to jump to my appearance tab. Like always, I'm going to remove the style here, set the background style to be a flat color, and I might make this just a shade of blue. Again, this is just a personal preference so I can see where it actually sits on my page. I'll then jump to my layout tab, and the first thing I'll need to do is update the container layout. Once again, because I'm going to be positioning elements horizontally across my page here, I'm going to set this to be a row. I'll then need to just update the responsive settings of my width to begin with. So I'm going to unselect that this should be a fixed width. I'll set the minimum width to be 0 here. And then for the time being, I'm going to keep the maximum width as infinite. However, later on, I am going to come back and update some of these settings once again. But from here, what I want to do is add in my 3 elements inside of this group. And the first of those is just going to be a text element. So I'm going to head to my visual elements here. I will add a text element in, and I'll have this display the words become a host. And I would like to remove the style of this text so I can bold the formatting of it. I'll then jump to my layout tab. And when it comes to the width of this element, I'm going to unselect that it should be a fixed width. Like always, I'm going to set the minimum width as 0. Only instead of leaving the maximum width as infinite, I'm going to tick this option once again to fit the width of this element to the content inside of it, which just means it's going to collapse nicely around the text. I'm then going to do pretty much the same thing for our height. If I set that as 0, it will once again collapse nicely around the text. And then finally, if I just move my property editor up, I'm going to add in 10 pixels of margin on the left here, which will just ensure that it doesn't touch the borders of my group. And then finally, I will vertically align that in the center of my overall blue group. Next to this, I'm going to display this little hamburger icon that Airbnb does. That's nice and simple to add in. If I jump to my visual elements, I can select to add in yet another icon. And if you just type in the word bar, you'll see the option to add in the 3 bars, which if you didn't know is referred to as a hamburger menu. And then when it comes to the style of this icon, I'm just going to choose to remove that because I'd like to add in my own custom color code, which is just a light shade of gray here. If you'd like that, it's 787878. I'm then going to, of course, need to update the size of this icon. So if I jump to my layout tab, I'm going to then update the width of this to be 30 pixels, as well as the height to be 30 pixels. And I will be keeping these as fixed options because I'm only ever going to want it to be 30 by 30. I will then vertically align this in the center and just add in 20 pixels of margin on the left, so that way it doesn't touch my text there. And then finally, what I'd like to do is just add in an image which will just display a user's profile photo. So what I'm going to do is just scrolling down to my visual elements here, I'll add in an image element. And when it comes to this particular image, once someone creates an account, there's no guaranteeing that they're going to upload a custom profile photo. And so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to upload a static image that's going to display here. However, I'm going to add what's referred to as a condition, which will just recognize if someone has uploaded a custom profile photo. I'd like to display that instead of my default image here. And so if I head to my static image and upload an image from my device here, I just have a basic image of a user's alias. So you can definitely just Google search user alias, and then you can save an image like this. What I would like to do is just set the roundness of this image to be 100. So that way when I reduce the size of it, it becomes a perfect circle. I will then just jump over to my layout tab here, and then I'm going to update the width of this to be 40 pixels. And I'm going to tick this option to keep this element's aspect ratio fixed. And I'm going to set that as 1:1, which just means it's now going to be 40 pixels by 40 pixels. I can then vertically align this in the center of my blue group. And then finally, I'll be adding 10 pixels of margin on the left, so that way it doesn't touch my little hamburger icon. And now, as I mentioned, at this point, this image is just going to display a static user alias. However, what I'd like to do is just recognize if someone has in fact uploaded a custom profile photo, in which case I'd like to display that image instead. So what we're going to do is head to what's referred to as the condition tab. And this is where you'll really start to see the power of Bubble come to life. Essentially, conditions allow you to create unique behavior that occurs in your app if a condition has been met. So in this case, I'm going to create a condition, and I'm just going to recognize if the current user, so that is the person who has logged into their account, if their profile photo data field is not empty, meaning they have taken the time to upload a custom profile photo. What I'd like to do is update the image source here, and instead of displaying what's known as a static image, which is an image I upload, I'm going to display a dynamic image. And so this is where I can start to reference the data that's been stored in my database. And so what I can reference is the current user. Once again, that is the person who is logged in. I can display their own profile photo. And now that's going to adapt to any user. So if I'm logged into my account, I'm going to see my profile image. If you're logged into yours, you're going to see your profile image. And just a personal preference I have when I'm working with small images is I just like to select the More option, and I process these with Imgix. And what this just allows me to do is tick this option here to resize and fit the dimensions by cropping it. So that just means that if an image isn't quite the right dimensions for this circle, it will just resize them and make sure it expands out and crops the image so it looks much cleaner. I'm then going to choose to validate that, and that's everything I'd like to add into my overall blue group here. So I'm going to select on the blue group, I'll jump to my layout tab, and what I'd like to do is now just reduce the height of this to once again be 0, similar to my previous elements. Then I'm going to vertically align this in the center of my overall white group. I'm then going to also want to remove all of this empty space to the right hand side here. And the way I can do that is by ticking the option to fit the width of this element to the content inside of it. So now it's going to collapse nicely around all of my elements there. And then similar to before with my container alignment, I'm going to make sure this is the space around option. And that's everything I want to change for this blue group. And at this point, we've almost completed the process of creating our header menu. What we can do is click on the overall header menu itself, and now we can update some of its settings. So I'm going to first of all update the container alignment to once again be the space around option. And what you'll now see is that we have an even amount of space between all of my different elements here. And then from here, I'm just going to open up my property editor once again, because I'd like to just update the height now to be set as 0. And what you'll now see is that it has collapsed nicely around all of my elements, although it is looking quite tight. So what I can do is just add in some margins on my biggest element. So if I click on my red circle group here, I'm just going to head to my margins and add in 20 pixels of margin at the top and 20 pixels of margin at the bottom. And because all of my other elements are vertically aligned to the center of my white group, these will always remain level with each other. And that is how we can create our header menu here. There is just one small change I want to make to this blue group. I just want to add in 20 pixels of margin on the right, so that way it never touches the border of my actual white group. One thing I should show you is that if I jump to my responsive menu, if I was to scale this page out to a full desktop device, you'll see all of my elements evenly spaced apart. If I was to then reduce the width of this, you'll see these will also scale down. At this point, they're not quite 100% responsive. However, we will be updating some changes and configurations in a moment. But as you can see, we've got a great start to our header menu. And I know at this point, it feels like we've been building for a while, and this is all we've created. But thankfully, because we built this as a reusable element, we only have to build our header menu once, and we can easily just add that into any page within our app. And that's exactly what we're going to do now. So if I jump to my UI builder here, I'm going to open up my page dropdown and open up our index page. And now the index page is going to be a default page that comes in any bubble editor. It's essentially known as the home page for your application. So this is where users are first going to land whenever they open your application. And if I was to select on this overall page here, before I add in my header menu, there's a couple of changes I'd like to make. The first is that if I jump to my appearance tab, I'm going to update the background color. I'm going to make this just a very faint shade of gray here. And the reason I do that, again, is because this is just a purely personal preference, is that when I'm working in my bubble editor, I just want to be able to see where my page lies here. Of course, when you go to publish your application or preview it, you can just set the background color to be none and it will revert back to white. The other thing I'm going to need to do is update the container layout of my page. Now, when it comes to an overall page, unlike our groups, in 99% of instances, I set the container layout to be a column, because if we were to look at the Airbnb product here, what you'll see is that this page is built from the top down to the bottom. So at the top, we have a header menu, then we have a list of all of our categories, followed by a list of all of our properties. So most applications or even websites are stacked from the top down. So when it comes to your overall page, I personally recommend setting the container layout to be a column, because that of course allows you to stack elements vertically, not horizontally. Then once I've configured the container layout of my page, I can add my header menu that I've just created onto this page. And it's as simple as dragging one element onto it. So if I just move my head out of the way here, I'm going to scroll right down to the bottom of my elements, and you'll see the option to add a reusable element in here. And you'll also see the option to add in our header menu. Now I can just click and add that in, and just like that, it's going to import the element that we have already created into our application. Now, one thing I should just point out is that although this element lives on our home page, what you'll find is that you can't actually click into this and make changes to any of the elements here. What you'll need to do is open up your page drop-down menu and make any changes inside this section of our app. So if you ever want to change, let's say, the logo, you'll just upload a new logo here, and that will automatically be reflected upon any instance where this element is positioned in your app. So again, to my point about reusable elements, you only have to design it once, and then you can reference it at any given point in time. And look, for those who are brand spanking new to Bubble, I do apologize because a reusable element is more of an intermediate feature. So please don't stress if you're a little bit overwhelmed with all these concepts that I'm throwing out. It definitely was a little bit before I started using reusable elements myself. However, I just wanted to use one in our tutorial today, so we only have to go through the process of designing this header menu once. I don't want to have to create this every single time I add in a new page into my app. But from here, you can really start to see that we have the building blocks of our overall page. The next thing I'd like to add onto this page is just going to be this list of categories here. And now, if you remember, we had stored this list as a series of option sets within our database. And this is where we can start to reference and display those. So if I open up my bubble editor once again, what I'd like to do is display a list of data essentially stored within my database. And so when it comes to displaying a list of things inside of Bubble, you'll need to use what's called a repeating group element. And by this point in time, you're probably sick of me saying the word group, but a repeating group is by far one of my favorite elements within Bubble, as it gives you so much power to create truly amazing experiences. So if I was to add a repeating group onto my page, what you'll see is that this is just going to look like a row of cells, kind of like a spreadsheet, and that's because it essentially is. A repeating group allows you to, as I mentioned, display a list of items that are stored within your database. And a great example of when you would use a repeating group is if you were creating, let's say, something like an Instagram clone application. So if you wanted to display a feed of posts on your homepage, a repeating group is going to allow you to dynamically pull different images and display those to different users. So you'll find that whenever you're creating a list of items in Bubble, a repeating group is really going to be your best friend. It's an element that's by far the most powerful, and it gives you so much flexibility in terms of the experiences you can create. And so today I'm going to be displaying a list of categories horizontally across the top of our page here. So if I jump into my Bubble editor, the first thing I'm going to do is not update the container layout. Instead, I'm going to head to my Appearance tab, and I'm going to need to update the type of content that's going to be displayed within this repeating group. So because this repeating group is going to dynamically pull data from our database, and by the word dynamic, I just mean that it's going to pull different data for different users. What we'll need to do is first of all identify what type of data it should display within this list. And in this case, if you remember in our database, I'm just going to open this up here. In our list of option sets, we had the categories laid out here, which was just a list of all the different types of categories that an Airbnb could fall under. And for each option, I was storing, first of all, the name of the category, as well as an image. And it's at this point in time that I'd like to display all of these categories. So in my Design tab, I'm going to set the type of content here to be a category. And then I'm going to need to add in a data source so my repeating group knows which particular categories to display. And in this case, this is really simple. I just want to display all of my categories. It is as easy as that. And now before I update the layout settings of my repeating group here, I'm going to just need to update the way in which we're displaying our rows and columns for this repeating group. So I'm going to unselect the default options here. And I'm going to select that instead of this repeating group displaying vertically, so from top to bottom, I want this to actually display horizontally. So this is going to allow me to scroll side to side, similar to the real world Airbnb experience here. So see how you can scroll horizontally across this list. And before I can jump ahead into my layout tab and update the responsive settings of this repeating group element, one thing you may have noticed within your Appearance tab is that we have these additional settings that we can configure, and these are going to determine the number of rows and cells in which our repeating group will display. So at this point in time, what I can see, because these two items are ticked here, we have a fixed number of rows. So these are the individual cells that you see within a repeating group, as well as a fixed number of columns. So there's only one column, which means there's one row of 4. And so right now, this repeating group, if it was to display a list of all of my categories, it's only going to display the first 4 categories and nothing more, whereas that's not the experience I want to create. Similar to the real world Airbnb product, I want to display all my categories horizontally across my page, and I want users to be able to scroll across within these. And so what we're going to need to do is actually just customize the settings of our rows here. And look, when it comes to repeating groups, this can be a little bit overwhelming, particularly if you are quite new to Bubble. So of course, I'm going to be sure to explain everything in as much detail as I can here. But don't be alarmed if you do find it slightly confusing in the beginning. Of course, like everything, practice does make perfect. And repeating groups definitely are a little bit more of an intermediate feature within Bubble. So what we're going to do today is we're going to first of all update the number of rows that this repeating group displays. So right now it has 4 rows. Whereas if you were to look at the number of rows in our repeating group here, there's only 1 row because it's only displaying 1 line of items. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to update the number of rows to be 1, and I am going to keep that to be a fixed value because I will only ever want to display 1 item on 1 row. However, when it comes to the number of columns, this is how many entries are going to be positioned horizontally. I essentially just want this to be an infinite amount. So I want this to display all of the categories I've created. So within Bubble, what I'm going to do is unselect that this should be a fixed number of columns. And right now, it'll just leave what's called a minimum width on this particular column. So inside of each column, what you'll see here is that the width between each cell is now going to be at minimum 100 pixels. And this is a setting that we can come back and update later on. I'm not too concerned about this right now. One thing I do like to do while I'm working with my repeating groups is also just remove the style of these. And instead of adding a background color like I do for my groups, I'm just going to scroll on down and add a solid border around this. So that way, if I was to click away, I can see where it actually sits on my page. I'm then going to select on the repeating group itself. And this is where we can now jump over into our layout tab. And when it comes to a repeating group, each individual cell in a repeating group acts as almost like a group of itself, hence the name, a repeating group, because it's just repeating a number of different groups. And so, of course, because we're leveraging a group element, it's going to require me to set a container layout. And in this case, if I was to look at the real-world Airbnb example, within each little group here that houses every individual category, I can see that there is an icon element, as well as a text element, and these are stacked on top of each other. So that means, of course, we're stacking elements vertically. So our container layout will need to be a column. When it comes to the width of this element, I'm going to unselect that this should be a fixed width. And for this repeating group, I'm essentially just going to want it to expand across the full width of my page. So what I'm going to do is set the minimum width to be 0 and leave the maximum width to be infinite. And if I was to now just jump over into the responsive preview of this page, what you'll see is that this repeating group will continually expand out or even collapse based on how much space it can take on our page. And you'll notice as well that when I change the size of the page, the number of columns will either be reduced or it will be expanded. So this repeating group just knows to display as many items as it possibly can. I'm just going to jump back to my UI builder for now though. I'm going to open up my property editor once again. And look, when it comes to the height and the margin, we will be editing those, but I'm first of all going to want to add the elements I want to display inside of this repeating group. And as I mentioned, I'm only going to want to display the icon as well as the category title. And this is something we can easily add in. So for that icon element, because we've saved those within our option set list as an image, what I'm going to do is head to my visual elements and add an image element into our repeating group cell. And what you'll now notice is that our repeating group cell has expanded out in width. And the reason for that is because if I was to select on my repeating group again, you may remember that the minimum width of each column was 100 pixels. And now that is the minimum. So it currently doesn't have a maximum. So this column will expand out as much as it possibly can. However, it just knows that it can't shrink below 100 pixels. So what I'm going to do from here is just click on this image. And now if I want to display the image of the category from our option set, I'm just going to open up my database here. And if I was to open up my option set list and select our categories, you may remember that we had created the image attribute for each option set. So if I was to modify the attributes of our lakefront category, you'll see that we have saved the image itself into our attribute. So I'm just going to close this. And the reason I wanted to show you that is because if I want to display each category's unique image or icon, what I could do is head to our dynamic image field. So our dynamic image just refers to data that it's going to pull from our database and populate within our Bubble app. What I could do is insert dynamic data, and I could reference the current cell's category. And now by selecting the current cell, that just means that, let's say this repeating group is displaying our list of, let's say 10 categories. This cell here would be cell number 1, which would be our lakeside category. Cell number 2 here could be our beaches category. Cell number 3 could be our farms category. and the list would just go on. So this image here knows to display the current cell. So the option that sits within this unique cell, it's image here. And it is as simple as that. And that is all we'll need to configure for our image data source. What we can then do is jump over into our layout tab here. And I'd like to update the size of this image because right now it is quite large. I'm going to set the width of this image to be 40 pixels. And I am going to leave this as a fixed value because I will only ever want this to be 40 pixels regardless of how small or large the page is. I'm also going to tick this option to keep this element's aspect ratio fixed. And if I leave this at a 1:1 ratio, this is going to make it 40 pixels by 40 pixels. And then finally, I'm going to horizontally align this image in the center of my repeating group cell. So that way it's always going to be positioned nicely. And while we're here, I'd also just like to add in 30 pixels of margin at the top, so that way it's not touching the top of my repeating group there. Now below this, I'd like to just display the text of this category. So I'm going to head to my visual elements here. I'll select to add a text element into this. And when it comes to the text I want to display, it of course is just going to be the name of this category. So I'm going to insert dynamic data, and I'd like to display the current cells category, its display text. So that is the name of the category stored within our option set. Now I'd like to also remove the style of this text, just because I'd like to center this text within the text element itself. And then for the layout tab here, I'm going to update the width of this image. Now I'd like to unselect that this should be a fixed width. And if I set the minimum width as 0 and leave the maximum width as infinite, this text element is going to take up as little or as much space as it needs in order to display each category's title. I'm then also going to set the minimum height to be 0. And because we have this option selected here by default to fit the height of this element to the content within it, it's going to collapse nicely around all of the text. What I would just like to do is add some margins around this text element so that way it is not touching our image element as well as the borders of our repeating group. So what I'm going to do is add in 10 pixels of margin at the top, then 30 pixels of margin at the bottom, 30 pixels of margin on the left, and 30 pixels of margin on the right. I'd also just like to horizontally align this text in the center of our repeating group, so that way, similar to our image above it, it will always remain in the center. And look, that's all we'll need to add within this particular repeating group right now. It is relatively straightforward. We're only going to add in 2 simple elements. What we can do now is select on the overall repeating group because I'd like to close off all of this empty space at the bottom. And so in order to do that, I'm going to open up the property editor for my repeating group. And within my layout tab, if I was to set the minimum height as 0, because we have this option selected once again by default to fit the height of this element to the content inside of it, it's going to collapse nicely around all of our elements. And because our text element has some margin at the bottom of it of 30 pixels, this repeating group isn't actually going to touch the text element there. And then just a personal preference I have while we're in our layout tab is that I just like to add 50 pixels of margin on the left and 50 pixels of margin on the right. So that way our repeating group itself won't touch the borders of my page. Now what I'd love to do is just show you a quick preview of how this is going to look within our product. So I'm just going to hit the preview button here. And now at this point, you'll see we have a list of all of our categories being automatically pulled from our database. And what you'll notice is that because our list extends past how many cells are being displayed by default in our repeating group, what we can actually do is scroll across and users can select from any of the additional categories here. And now, of course, at this point in time, I should just point out that with our repeating group, I had left the solid border around it, which is why you can see all of these lines here. But of course, if you wanted to remove those when you either preview or publish your application, that's as simple as just changing one configuration. I'm just going to leave those as they are for the time being though, just because it's actually going to help me see where these sit on my page. What I'd love to do though is just quickly jump back into my Notion checklist here, which is just going to keep a track of where we are throughout our build. And at this point in time, I just want to tick off that for our homepage, we have built out the navigation bar. We've also taken the time to now build out the list of categories. The very last thing I want to do is just explain how we can add a list of properties on our homepage here. And as you've probably guessed, because we're displaying a list of items that are stored within our database, we're going to once again use another repeating group element. And so if I was to jump back into my bubble editor here, what I'd like to do is add another repeating group below our existing repeating group of categories. And instead of displaying a list of categories, I'd just like to display a list of properties. So I'm going to scroll on down to our containers menu. I will add in yet another repeating group. And when it comes to this repeating group, we're going to jump over to our appearance tab, because once again, the first thing we're going to do is set a data source for this repeating group. So that way Bubble knows which particular items to display within it. And in this instance, we're going to display a list of properties. And then for the data source, instead of pulling from a list of option sets, we're going to search for a list of properties in our database. And when we perform that search, we can actually customize which specific properties can be displayed to specific users. So let's say you're a user who lives in San Francisco. What we could do is display a list of properties that are within a certain radius of your current location. And so the way in which we can do that is, as I mentioned, we can perform a search through our database. So I'm going to select the do a search for option here, and I'm going to search for a list of properties. And then you'll see we have this option to add what's known as a constraint. So on this search for properties right now, it's just going to display every single property in our database. Whereas if I wanted to refine which specific properties are going to be displayed for someone, I can add almost like search filters here. And so if I was to add a new constraint, what I'm going to do is display properties that are within a certain radius of a user's current location. So I'm going to select from the address field for our properties, which if you remember in our database is set as a geographic address. So I'm going to search for all of the properties where the address of that property is within, and then I can just type in a number of my choice. So I'm going to say is within 300 kilometers. I'll use the metric value here of, and in this case, I'd like to pull the current user's location. And so in order to do this, I can scroll on down and you'll see there's this option to pull the current user's geographic position. So if a user has enabled location services within their browser or their device, it will automatically be able to pull their position for you. So now this is going to display a list of properties that are essentially within a 300 kilometer radius of my current location. And I just like to sort all of the properties that are returned from our database in a random order. So I'm just going to scroll on down to this random sorting option, which just means it's going to give an even amount of distribution to any properties it displays in this repeating group. And that's how we can configure our data source here. I'm going to close this. And now when it comes to the number of rows and columns within this particular repeating group, if we were to open up the real world Airbnb product, you'll see that there's essentially an infinite amount of items that are going to be displayed here. So a user can just continually scroll through. If I was to even reduce the size of my browser here, what you'll see is that these images are going to update in size accordingly, as well as the number of properties that can in fact be displayed. And so within our bubble editor, in order to create that exact same experience, I'm going to unselect that this repeating group should have a fixed number of rows. And I'm also going to unselect that it should have a fixed number of columns. So right now, this is just going to have an infinite amount of cells, and it will display as many as it can across our page. Now, I'm just going to leave these two values here as they are for now, because I want to explain something beforehand. If I was to jump into my layout tab, I'm just going to set the container layout here to be a column, because if we look at a cell here, you can see that there's an image stacked on top of some text, stacked on top of a price. So everything is stacked vertically. So that's why we're selecting the column option once again. But if I was to unselect that this should be a fixed width, and similar to before, set the minimum width to be 0, leaving the maximum width to be infinite, what that's going to do is just ensure, of course, that this repeating group can be as small or as large as the page will allow. However, it's at this point that I want to jump back to our appearance tab to update these values. And the reason why I wanted to just update the layout settings first was just to illustrate how our repeating group currently looks. So at this point in time, the minimum size of our repeating group in terms of its height and width is going to be 100 pixels by 100 pixels, which is why you can see lots of little squares right now. However, at this point in time, I'm going to update the minimum width of each column, and I'm going to set this to be 320 pixels. And of course, what you'll see is that because the minimum width is quite large, it's going to expand out and in turn display a lower count of cells on our page. And now the reason why I've selected 320 pixels as the minimum value here, remembering that this is the minimum. If a repeating group needs to be larger, it can in fact take up more space. However, it will never be smaller than 320 pixels. And the reason I've selected that is because if I jump into my responsive menu here, what you'll see is that if I click on a mobile device, the smallest possible size of any mobile device, so I'm talking an iPhone 5 here, it's going to be 320 pixels. Now, most mobile devices sit at about 380 pixels, so at about here. However, the smallest possible device someone could have is a iPhone 5, let's say, and that's going to be 320 pixels. And so this just ensures that the smallest possible size of our repeating group is going to be the same size as a mobile device. And so that is why I've selected this value. I will come back later on and update the height, but before I do that, I need to add all of my elements into this repeating group cell. So I'm going to jump back into my UI builder. And one thing I should also just quickly do is, like always, just remove the style of this repeating group. And I'm going to add just a solid border around this so I can see where it lies on my page. Of course, we can update that later on. But what I'd like to now do is add in all of my elements that I'm going to display within this repeating group. And so the first thing I'd like to add in is going to be an image of this property. So I'm going to head to my visual elements. I will add an image into the first cell of my repeating group here. And when it comes to the image I would like to display, if you remember in our database here within our data types, we had our data type for our property and then a separate data type which was storing our property images. And within this overall data type, we had a data field which was that list of images. And then back on our property data type, we had a data field that linked to our property images. So if I wanted to display any of the images, what I'll need to do is insert dynamic data. So I'm going to be pulling data from my database. And in this case, I'd like to display the current cell's property. So that is going to be the property within this cell. I would like to reference its images data field, which is linked to my separate images data type. And I want to display its list of images saved within that. And now, because I'd only like to display one image here, I'm going to select to display the very first item. If you would like, you could choose a random item or even a specific number. But I'm just going to want to display the first image that was uploaded for this property. So you can think of that almost like the featured image. And now one thing I should have pointed out before is that when you're working on a repeating group, you will, as you've probably noticed, only need to update the first cell, and then Bubble's going to pre-populate every other cell based on the elements you add into this. I'm sure you saw that when I built out my categories repeating group, but it's just something I wanted to bring to your attention. And once I've updated the data source for this image, I'm just going to scroll on down and update some of the styling settings. So just a personal preference of mine is that I'm going to set the roundness of this image's borders to be 20. And while I'm working on most images, I do also like to add a solid border around them, just so I can see where they actually sit on my page. But that's all I'd just like to change here. Of course, I'm also going to need to update the size of this image. So if I jump to my layout tab here, what I'd like to do is update the width of this image. At this point in time, it is a fixed width of 320 pixels. So it's going to take up the full space of my repeating group cell, because if you remember, the cell had a minimum width of 320. In this instance, I'm going to unselect that this should be a fixed width. And instead of setting the minimum value to be 320, I'm actually going to set this to be 300. And now the reason I'm doing that is because I'd like to add in 10 pixels of margin around every border of this image. So if I add in 10 pixels at the top, 10 on the bottom, 10 on the left, and 10 on the right. One thing I should point out is that if the minimum width of our image is going to be 300 pixels, and I have an extra 10 pixels of margin on each side, 10 plus 300 plus another 10 is going to equal 320, which is the minimum width of our repeating group cell. And so that's just going to ensure that this fits quite nicely within our repeating group. Now, I am going to keep the maximum width as infinite because I'd like this image to expand and scale up if our user's browser allows the room to do so. However, because it has that minimum value of 300 pixels, it will never get smaller than that Another thing I'd like to do is select to keep this element's aspect ratio fixed. And I'm going to keep this at a 1:1 ratio. So that way it can be, let's say at the minimum, 300 pixels by 300 pixels. And that's all we'll need to customize for our image here. What I'd like to do now is add in a text element that's going to display the city in which this property is located. So I'm going to head to my visual elements. I'll select to add a text element into my repeating group. And this is going to automatically be positioned at the top. However, we're going to move this down in a moment. But what I'd like to first do is just determine what text is going to be displayed here. So for every property that is uploaded, someone's going to give it an address. And in this case, what I'd like to do is just extract from that address the city in which this property is positioned. And so in order to do that, I'm going to insert dynamic data and display the current sales property, its address field. However, if I select this more option here, you'll see we have the ability to extract a value from that address. And the component I'd like to extract is going to be the city. I can then close this. When it comes to the styling of this element, I'm just going to remove this because I'd like to make this text slightly larger. Because in this case, I'd like to set the text here to be 18. And then I also want to bold this text. And that's all I'll change for the styling. If I was to jump over to my layout tab here, I'd then like to update the responsive settings of this text field. So I'm going to unselect that this should be a fixed width. Like always with text elements, I'll be setting the minimum width as 0, leaving the maximum width as infinite. So that way it will take up as little or as much room as it possibly can. I'm then also going to set the minimum height to be 0. And because we have this default option selected to fit the height of this element to the content within it, it will collapse nicely around that text. And while we're here, I'm also going to add in 10 pixels of margin at the top, 20 pixels of margin on the left, and 20 pixels of margin on the right. And that's just going to ensure that this text element won't touch the borders of my repeating group. And then finally, I'm going to select that I want to move this to the next position within my repeating group, which means it's going to sit below my image element here. And then below this text element, I'd like to add another, which similar to the real world Airbnb product, I just like to display how many kilometers away a property is to someone's current location. So if I jump into my editor, I'm going to once again add another text element into my repeating group here. And in this instance, I'm going to insert dynamic data and display the current sales property. Once again, its address, so its location. And then if I was to select the more option here, you'll see that I can calculate the distance from this address. And it will just require me to identify an original address to calculate the distance from. And in this case, the origin address is once again just going to be, if I scroll on down, the current geographic position of the user, which will also be formatted as an address. And I'm just going to calculate this in kilometers. I will close this. I will also select the more option because I just like to make sure I format this as a number. I'm just going to also add in 1,000 separator, so that way if it's over 1,000 kilometers, it's just going to have a comma in that. Then I'm going to close this, and I just like to display the word kilometers. So I'm just going to click here, I'll add a space, and I'll manually type in the word kilometers. Then when it comes to the styling of this text element, I'm actually quite happy to leave this as the default body copy style. I don't want to make any changes there. What I will do is just jump into my layout tab because of course I'm going to need to make this element fully responsive. So like always, I will take the time to unselect that this should be a fixed width. I will set the minimum width as 0, leaving the maximum width as infinite. So that way this text element can be as small or as large as it needs to be. I'll then set the minimum height to be 0, and because we have the option selected by default to fit the height of this element to the content inside of it, it's going to collapse nicely around all of that text. I'll finally then just add in 10 pixels of margin at the top and 20 pixels of margin on each side here. And of course, I'll just move this to the next position within my repeating group, so that way it sits below my city title. And now the very last thing I'd like to add into this repeating group cell is just going to be the price per night of this property. And in order to streamline this whole process, what I could actually do is just make a copy of this existing text element here. I'll then jump to my appearance tab. And if you ever want to quickly clear all this text within your text element, you can just right click in this field and clear all, and then it's going to reset the value of that. And from here, I can just select which particular values I'd like to pull from this property. So I'm going to insert dynamic data, and I'd like to display the current sales property. And if I scroll on down, I'm going to select the price per night data field, which is going to be a number. However, I'd obviously like to format that as a currency, so that way it displays the dollar amount. So if I select the more option here, I'm going to choose to format this number as a currency. I will add a 1,000 separator once again, and I'm also going to add my currency symbol as a dollar, just because I use dollars where I currently live. I'm then going to close this, and then I will add in some additional text here that I'm manually going to type. I'm going to add in a space, and I'm going to type in the word per night. And what I'd actually like to do is just bold the dollar amount, but leave the other text, which is per night, as the current option. So if we select to open up our rich text editor here, what you'll see is it's going to open up this little editor where we can customize the formatting of this text. And I'm just going to highlight all of my dynamic text forwards. So this is just the dynamic, I guess you could say, expression where I'm pulling the data of the price per night and formatting it as dollars. What I'm going to do is choose to bold this. So that way now the dollar amount will be in bold and the rest of the text will not. And then while we're in our rich text editor here, I'd also just like to highlight all of the text and underline this. So that way it matches the same formatting as the Airbnb product. I will choose to save this text formatting. And finally, the very last thing I'll need to do here is jump over to my layout tab. And because this is the last element I'd like to add within my repeating group cell, I'm just going to add in 30 pixels of margin at the bottom of this. So that way there is a nice amount of space below all of our elements. And that's actually everything we'll need to do in terms of configuring this repeating group. Now, if we were to take a preview of our application, what you'll find is that there won't actually be anything to display within this repeating group. And that is because we haven't yet added any properties into our database. So this repeating group doesn't have any data to display. However, once I, of course, walk you through the process of how you can actually create a property, these will definitely be displayed across our homepage. And to be honest, that's everything I want to cover within this particular section of our tutorial. As I mentioned, this was probably one of the meatier sections of our tutorial, in fact, today. And of course, our homepage is going to be one of the key experiences we create within our Airbnb clone. And I know that if you're relatively new to Bubble, all of this might seem completely overwhelming, and that is fine. There was a lot of concepts that I covered in comparison to other tutorials that I've recorded, but I really just want to try and replicate the real world Airbnb product as closely as we possibly can. So that's why I wanted to explain how we can add things like repeating groups, reusable elements, and even our option set categories. And of course, if you found yourself getting confused at any point in time, I'd recommend pausing the tutorial and just rewatching any of these sections that I've covered. From here though, I'd just like to jump back into my Notion checklist and tick off that we've finished displaying a list of properties onto our homepage. And I can also tick off that we've finished designing our overall homepage as well. Moving down through my list of features that I have laid out for us in our Notion doc today, I actually just wanted to skip ahead for the sake of this tutorial to the feature where we're going to create a search function within our Airbnb clone. And now I've actually broken this particular feature into a couple of different steps, but within our search feature, I'd first of all like someone to input their desired location as well as their dates, followed by a total count of how many guests they'd like to stay at that property. And then later on, we're going to display a list of all of the relevant properties based on a user's search query. And so what we want to do today is create an experience that replicates the real-world Airbnb product. So if you remember, over in Airbnb, in the top header menu, they had almost like this little placeholder group that sits in the menu itself. And when someone clicks on this, the menu expands and allows someone to add in a destination, a check-in date, a checkout date, as well as a total count of how many guests they have before they can then perform a search. Now, this is an experience that we can try and replicate within our own Bubble application. It's not going to look as glamorous as the real-world Airbnb product. However, it still will look quite nice. And so if I was to jump over into our bubble editor and open up our page drop-down menu, so I can open our header menu here, you may remember that we had created our own placeholder group here. And so if we were to replicate Airbnb's experience, essentially whenever this green group or any items in this group are clicked, what I'd like to do is create a feature that's going to hide this green group and display a series of input fields. And these are going to be the input fields here, like where someone can type in the destination, the check-in, and the checkout dates. And in order to build out this feature, we're going to need to leverage a custom state. Now, if you're not familiar with custom states, they're a great way to temporarily store data within your actual bubble page without having to access your database. And so why would you ever need to do that? And so this feature is a great example of when you should use a custom state. So essentially, whenever someone clicks on this green group here, I want to store some information on my page that just recognizes that our full search menu should be displayed instead of this little placeholder here. And so what I can do is just create a custom state that determines if the full menu should be visible or it should be hidden. And that will be stored in our page. So that way we don't even have to touch our database. And look, there are plenty of other use cases for custom states, like being able to store actual data in your page. And that's definitely something we're going to walk through at a later section in our tutorial. But for today, the first thing I'm going to do is just create a custom state that recognizes when we should display our full search menu or not. So I'm going to click on our green group here. And the first thing I'm going to do is just update the name of this group. So that way when I'm building out my workflows, I know exactly which group I'm referencing. Now I'm just going to call this group search placeholder, because this is essentially just the search placeholder that's going to sit here until someone clicks this, and then I'm going to display all of the relevant input fields. And then from here, I'm going to click on the overall red group that all of our elements sit within here. So this is our group search bar. And on this element, I would like to add our custom state. So as I mentioned, a custom state allows you to store some data in a page or an element, and they're actually quite hidden. So if you were to click on this information icon here, it's going to open up what's known as the element inspector menu. And the first thing you'll see is the option to add what's known as a new custom state. Now, when you create a new custom state, what you'll notice is that it looks the same as when you're to create a data field within your database. And that's because essentially you are. A custom state is a temporary data field that's stored in your page. And by temporary, what I mean is that if you were to store a value in your page through a custom state, and if the user was to refresh the page, that state and any information you have stored in it would also be refreshed. So that just means that it temporarily holds a value. And as I mentioned, custom states are a great feature because it saves you having to build out workflows that send data to your database. And for information like this, it's not actually essential to store that in our database because it would just create a lot of bloat that we don't need. And we're only going to need to know this information for a brief period of time. It's not like we're going to need to store a permanent record of it in our database. And so when it comes to this custom state, I'm just going to have this be called display full menu. And I'm going to set this state type to be a yes or no option because I'd either like to display my full menu or I won't want to display that full menu. I'm going to choose to create this. And what I love about custom states is that you can also set a default value. And so in this case, I'm going to set the default value to be no, because I don't want to display my full menu as soon as the page is loaded. I'm actually going to want to just keep my placeholder menu here until someone clicks on that. I'm going to close my element inspector here, and then I'm going to click on my green group. Now, whenever someone clicks on this green group, what I'm going to do is set a value in my custom state, or I guess you could say update the value in my custom state. And I'm going to set the display full menu custom state to now be yes. And so I'm going to click on the green placeholder group here. I will start a workflow whenever this is clicked. And within this workflow, I'm just going to type in the word state, and I'll now set the state of an element. The element I'll be setting our state for is going to be the group search bar, and the custom state will be the display full menu state. And I'd like this to equal yes. So in this case, I'm going to be turning the full menu on. And now one additional thing I want to do is create a condition on this workflow trigger here. So because this workflow is going to set the custom state to be yes, I'm only going to want it to run whenever the custom state is currently no. So if I was to select on our workflow trigger here, I'm going to create a condition and just identify that this should only run when the display full menu custom state is in fact no, not yes. And so I'm going to recognize when the search bar here, when its display full menu custom state is currently no, this workflow will be allowed to run and it will now switch it to yes. Now, because this workflow here is going to be involved with my search experience, I'm going to update the event color of this to be green, so that way I can tell it apart from my additional workflows. And from here, I'm going to jump back into my design tab, because this is where I can start to add in all of the relevant search fields once that custom state has been set to yes. Now, the first thing I'll need to do is actually just hide this green group. So as I mentioned, this group is just going to act as a placeholder, but when someone actually opens up the full search menu, I'm going to want this group to be hidden, and I'll have all of the inputs taking its place. So I'm going to head to my layout tab here. And when I'm working on this group, I'm going to keep this visible on page load. However, I'm just going to tick this option to collapse this group when it's hidden, which just means that it's not going to take up any space on my page when it's not being displayed. I'll then jump over to my conditional tab because I'd like to define a condition that's just going to recognize when our group search bar, when its display full menu custom state is in fact currently yes, I'm going to select that this element is visible, and I will not be ticking that that is true, which just means that this element is now going to be hidden. And if I really wanted, I could toggle this on and off here to see what that's going to look like. So as you'll see, when the display full menu state is set to yes, this group will no longer be visible. Now that's how we can hide the placeholder group. However, what I'd like to do now is add in our series of input fields similar to the real world Airbnb product. So I just want to be able to identify where the destination someone wants to search for is, what the check-in and check-out dates are, as well as how many guests they would like to add to their booking. And in order to do this, I'm going to add a series of groups into my existing red group here. So I'm going to scroll on down to my containers menu. I'm going to add a group element into my red group here. And when it comes to this group, I'm going to be calling this the group where. So this is going to house my destination search field. I'll then jump over to my appearance tab. And look, while I'm working on this group, I'm just going to remove the style of it so I can add a flat background color. And I could make that something like a light shade of green if I really wanted, just so that way I can actually see where it sits on my page. I'm then going to jump over to my layout tab because I'll need to update the container layout of this group. Now, if we were to look at the real world Airbnb product, this section here is going to be one group within my overall group. And as you can see within this group, it just has a text element, which is on top of a search field where someone can type in a destination. And so in order to stack these elements on top of each other, my container layout is going to need to be a column. From here, I'm then going to just update the width settings of this group. Like always, I'm going to unselect that should be a fixed width. I'll set the minimum width as 0, leaving the maximum width as infinite. So now this group is going to take up as little or as much space as it possibly can on my page. And then from here, I can start to add in all of the elements I want to display in this group before I then come back and update the height and the margin settings. So I'm just going to scroll on up to my visual elements. And the first thing I'll do is add in a text element. And I'll have this display the word where. Then when it comes to this text element, I'm just going to remove the style of this because I'd like to bold the formatting of this text. I'll then jump into my layout tab here. And for the width of this heading, I'm going to unselect that this should be a fixed width. I will set the minimum width as 0. And for the maximum width, I'm just going to actually tick this option to fit the width of this element to the content inside of it, which just means it's going to snap around all of the text inside of it there. For the height, I'm going to do much the same thing. I'm going to set the minimum height as 0. And because we have the default option selected here to fit the height of this element to the content inside of it, it's also going to snap around the bottom of the text. Then finally, I'm just going to add in 20 pixels of margin on the left for this text element. Now below this, I'd like to add in a search field, which is going to allow someone to search for either a neighborhood, a city, or even a country where they want to visit and book a property for. So if I scroll on down to my input forms, what you'll see is that there's an input form known as a search box in Bubble. I'm going to add this into my green group here. And the first thing I'm going to do with this search element is just update the name of this to be called search box location. And if you've never had the chance to work with a search box before, they essentially just allow you to search through a list of dynamic data, either in your database or with an integration with something like Google Maps, which is exactly what we're going to be using this element for today. So for the choices style here, you'll see that we have the ability to search through either a list of static choices we add in, a list of dynamic choices. So that means we can easily search through anything in our database, or we can search through a list of geographical places. Now that's exactly the option I'm going to select today. And that's going to automatically integrate with Google Maps. So that way a user can just type in any address, any city, any neighborhood, and it's automatically going to pre-fill that and allow them to select from a result. We don't actually have to do any other work than that. It's super straightforward. The only thing we will need to do is just update the layout settings of this element. Before I do that though, I'm also just going to update the placeholder text that displays inside of this element. I'm going to have this display the words search, destination. I'll then jump to my layout tab here. And when it comes to the width of this element, I'm going to unselect that this should be a fixed width. Like always, I'll be setting the minimum width as 0, leaving the maximum width as infinite. And this is going to allow this input field to be as small or as large as it possibly can within my green group. Then when it comes to the height, I'm going to leave this as the standard option, which is just 45 pixels, because I'm actually quite happy with this here. And look, that's everything I'll need to add within this green group. So what I'm going to do is now select on the overall group itself. I'll head to our layout tab, and I can update the height here to now be 0, which means it's going to collapse nicely around our input field. I'll also then add in some margin around our borders. So I'm going to add in 10 pixels of margin at the top, 10 on the bottom, and 10 on the left. I won't need to add any on the right here. I would also just like to vertically align this in the center of my overall red group. And one thing that's come to mind that I had forgotten to do was that I'm going to open up my search box once again, and I'm going to head to my appearance tab. And now this is just a personal preference, but I want to make the background of this search box transparent. I don't want it to be this white color. So I'm going to choose to remove the style of this here. I'll scroll on down to the background color, and I'll just make that to be none. I'll also do the same thing for our border below this. I'll set this to be none. And so that way our search box is going to almost look invisible at this point in time. However, because our placeholder text sits there, users are going to know that that is where they'll need to type in order to open up our search experience. Now, next to this group, I'm going to add in another, which is going to be our group that allows someone to select their check-in date. So I'm going to head to my containers menu. I'll add yet another group into my overall red group here. And I'll call this group check-in. For the style of this group, I'm going to remove this so I can set the background color to be a flat color. And look, while I'm working on this, I might make this just a shade of, let's say, purple. So that way I can easily differentiate between this group and my existing groups. I'll then jump to my layout tab. And when it comes to the container layout, once again, I'll have this be a column because I'll be stacking a heading on top of an input field. For the width of this group, like always, I will unselect that this should be a fixed width. I'll set the minimum width as 0, leaving the maximum width as infinite. So that way it's going to take up as little or as much space as it can on my page. And then finally, I can start to add all of my elements into this group here. And the first element is just going to be a text element. So to streamline that process, I'm just going to select our existing text element. I'll make a copy of that. I'll select in my purple group and paste this in. When it comes to this element, I'm just going to update this to display the words check-in. I'll also just jump to my layout tab, and with this particular text element, I just want to update the left-hand margin to be 10, not 20. Below this, I can then add in an input field, which will allow someone to select what date they want to check into a property. And thankfully, there is a pre-existing element that makes this super straightforward to do. If we head to our input forms, you'll see there's an option to add in a date time picker. Now, a date time picker, when selected, will open up a calendar view for someone to choose a particular date. So this is a very similar experience to the Airbnb product that I'd shown you before. So I'm going to update the name of this to be called date time picker check-in. So that way when we create our workflow later on, we know which element to reference. When it comes to the layout of this particular element, I'm going to, like always, unselect that this should be a fixed width, set the minimum width as 0, leave the maximum width as infinite. Now the height I'm quite happy with, again, at 45 pixels. However, I'm just going to jump to my appearance tab, and similar to our first input field, I just like to remove the background color and the border around this input. So for our style here, I'm going to remove this. I'll scroll on down and I'll set the background style to be none. And for the border, I'll also set that to be none. I can then click on my overall purple group. I'll jump to its layout tab and I can now update the height to be 0. So that way it collapses around all of the elements inside of it. I will vertically align this in the center of my red group. And then finally, I'm going to add in just 10 pixels of margin at the top, as well as 10 pixels of margin at the bottom. And now you can start to see that our search experience is slowly coming together. The next field I'd like to add in is going to be a group that displays the checkout date. And in order to streamline that whole process, I'm going to make a copy of our existing purple group here. Only this time I'm going to update the name of this group to be called group checkout. I will then update the text to display the word checkout. And finally, if I select the input field, which is our date time picker, I'll also update its name to be called checkout. And so now users will be able to select when they want to check in and when they want to leave. And now finally, the very last group I'd like to add into our overall search experience is just going to be a group that allows someone to select how many guests they want to add into their stay. And so once again, to streamline this whole process, I'm actually going to click on my existing group here. I'll make a copy of that and paste this in. When it comes to the name of this group, I'm going to call this group guests. Then for the elements inside of this, I'm going to update the text at the top to display the word who. Only in this instance, I'm going to jump to my layout tab and I'm just going to remove the left-hand side margin here. And the reason I'm doing that is because unlike my existing elements that have an input field below it, what you'll notice is that with these input fields, there's a little bit of space between where the input field starts and the actual characters within it. And so I've just been aligning our actual text with the start of the input characters. However, with this purple group, I'm going to select the input field and delete this. I'm going to then click on our text and I'm going to make a copy of this. So I'm going to have two text elements on top of each other in this group. And for this text, I'll have this display the words add guess, except I won't want this text to be bold. And I'm going to jump to my layout tab and just add in 10 pixels of margin at the top, so that way they are slightly separated. Now, when it also comes to the overall purple group that these two text elements sit within, what you'll notice is that because we don't actually have an input field in this group, it doesn't take up as much of vertical space as the existing groups here. And at this point in time, I've vertically aligned this in the center of my red group, which is why right now you can see it kind of drops down because it sits in the center. So what I'm going to do is just vertically align this at the top of our group. And now it'll be in line with all of the additional groups that we've created. And at this point in time, that is actually all of the groups I want to add into our search experience. One thing I should just point out is that right now, all of these groups are currently visible every single time the page is loaded. Whereas we actually only want these groups to be visible whenever the overall display search custom state is set to yes, meaning that the full search menu will be displayed once our search placeholder has been hidden. And so in order to create that experience, I can click on my first green group here, and I'm going to head to my layout tab, and I'm going to unselect this option to make this element visible on page load, which just means that by default, it's going to now be invisible. I'm also going to choose to collapse this element when it's hidden, so that way it doesn't take up any space when it's not being displayed. Of course, I'll then need to jump to my conditional tab and create a condition that just determines when this element should be visible. So I'm going to define a condition, and I'm going to recognize when the overall search bar, when its display full menu custom state is in fact yes, meaning we are going to be displaying all of these search fields. I want this element to be visible, and I want to tick that that should be true. And of course, I can toggle this on and off to see what that's going to look like. Now I'm going to need to create the exact same experience for my additional 3 groups here. And in order to streamline the whole process, what you can actually do, and this is a little hack I have in Bubble, is that you can right click on the green group and you'll see the option to copy your conditional formatting. So it's just going to copy this condition here. I can then select on my purple group. Then on our second group here, I can right click on this and choose to paste in my conditional formatting. So now it saves us having to write that whole condition from scratch. I'll then need to jump to my layout tab though, because I need to unselect that this group should be visible on page load, and I'd also like to collapse it when it's hidden. While I'm just working on these groups, I'm going to toggle this condition on so that way I can continually see it. I'm going to then do the exact same thing for my next group. So I'm going to right click on it, paste my conditional formatting, jump to my layout tab, unselect that it should be visible, and then I'm going to collapse this element when it's hidden. I'll then just make sure this condition is turned on so I can still see this group. And then finally, I'll do the same for our last group here. So I'll right click, paste conditional formatting, jump to my layout tab, unselect that should be visible, and collapse this when it's hidden. And look, I apologize that I ran through that relatively quickly, but these are the exact same conditions across all of our elements here. Now, one thing you may have noticed is that all of these groups right now are bunched up and they're quite small in comparison to how large they should be. So what we're actually going to do is create a condition on our overall red group here that just updates the width of this whenever the display full menu custom state is set to yes. So if I click on my red group and jump to my layout tab, you may remember that we had set a maximum width on this group to be 400 pixels. Which just meant that regardless of how large our page became, it wasn't able to stretch past 400 pixels in width. Whereas what I'd actually like this group to do is expand as long as it can whenever our display full menu state is set to yes. So I'm going to head to our conditional tab here, and I'm going to define a condition that recognizes when the search bar, when its display full menu custom state is once again yes. What I'll do is just select to update the maximum width of this element, and I'm going to leave that as infinite. Now, if I was to toggle this on and off, what you'll see is that it's going to take up as much space as it possibly can, and that's going to give our additional groups here some room to breathe. But one thing you will notice is that our group now touches the existing elements within our header menu. So in order to stop that from happening, I'm just going to jump to my layout tab here. I'll scroll on down and I'll just add in 20 pixels of margin on the left and right hand side of this overall group. And now what you'll see is that they no longer touch those elements. And now at this point, you can really start to see our search experience coming to life. However, there's 2 additional things we'll just need to add in before we can take a preview of this within our application. And the first thing is that at this point in our feature here, we've created a way to display our full search menu. However, what happens if someone wants to close that full search menu and just go back to the option they had before? What we'll need to do is create a way for someone to actually update the custom state on our group once again to then close this full menu. And the way I'm going to do that is just by adding a little cross icon in the side of our search bar that when clicked is going to update that custom state and switch it back to no. So I'm going to scroll on up to my visual elements. I will select to add an icon element to the very end of my red group here. And I'm just going to search for an icon which is known as the close icon. It's this little cross here. And for this icon, I'm going to remove the style of this because I'd like to add in a custom color. If you'd like this, it's just a light shade of gray that I'm using. The color code is 787878. I'll then jump to my layout tab because I'm obviously going to need to update the size of this icon. I'm going to set the width to be 20 pixels and then the height to also be 20 pixels. And I'll leave those both as fixed values. So that way it's always 20 pixels by 20 pixels. I'll then vertically align this in the center of our red group. And then finally, I'll also just add in 10 pixels of margin at the right of this element. So that way it doesn't touch the borders of my red group. Now for this icon element, I only want it to be visible when our display full menu custom state is set to yes. And then when someone clicks this, I want to set the state back to no, which means we're going to hide this full menu custom state. So within our layout tab here, I'm going to unselect that this element should be visible on page load. I'll of course collapse this element when it's hidden, so that way it doesn't take up any space. I'll then jump to our conditional tab, and I'll define a condition, and similar to the previous conditions we've created, I'm going to recognize when the group search bar, when its display full menu custom state is in fact set to yes, I would like this element to be visible and tick that should be true. I'll then just toggle this on for the time being. But what I'd also like to do while we're working on this element is create a workflow that's going to update our custom state value whenever this is clicked. So I'm going to head to my appearance tab here. I'll choose to start a workflow whenever this icon is clicked. And within this workflow, I'm going to once again update the state of an element. So I'm just going to type in the word state. I'll set the state of an element. The element will of course be our group search bar. And the custom state I'd like to change is our display full menu custom state. And I'm going to set this value to now equal no. Now, one thing I should point out is that I'm only going to want this workflow to run when the custom state is in fact currently yes, because we're going to be switching it off. So if I click on my workflow trigger here, I'm going to add a condition similar to what we've done on our previous green workflow. And in this condition, I'm going to recognize that this should only run when the group search bar, when its display full menu custom state is in fact currently yes, this workflow will run and it will switch it off to no. Now, because this workflow relates to my search feature, I'm going to once again update the event color to be green, so that way I can see that all of these green workflows are related to this one particular feature. And at this point in time, we're getting so close to finishing off this search experience. I know we've covered quite a lot already. However, there's one last thing I'd just like to update. And that is that what you'll notice with Airbnb is when you open up this full search menu, the little magnifying glass expands and displays the word search next to it, which just prompts a user to actually complete this search. And so that's an experience I'd also like to replicate. So if we jump back into Bubble here, what I'm going to do is add a text element into our existing circle group here. So I'm going to head to my visual elements. I'll add a text element next to my magnifying glass, and I'll have this display the word search. And although this text element doesn't look like it sits within my group, it definitely does. So I'm going to just remove the style of this. I'll update the color of this to be white. I'm going to jump into my layout tab then. And for the width of this text element, I will unselect that should be a fixed width. I'll be setting the minimum width as 0, leaving the maximum width as infinite. For the height, I'm also going to set that to be 0, so that way it will collapse around all of the text inside of it there. Now, obviously, this little circle group that I've created doesn't have enough space to fit both of these elements inside of it. So what I'm going to do is select on our circle group. And I can see right now that it currently has a fixed value of 40 pixels by 40 pixels. And so what I'm going to do is create a condition that just recognizes when our display full menu custom state is set to yes. I'd like to update the width of this group so we can comfortably fit both elements inside of it. So I'm going to define a condition, and once again, I'll just recognize when the group search bar, when its display full menu custom state is in fact set to yes, I'm going to update the width of this element, and instead of this being 40 pixels, I'm going to set this to be 100 pixels. Now, if I was to toggle this on, what you'll see is that is in fact going to expand out. However, there are still a few remaining changes I'll need to make in order to make this look much nicer. The other thing I'd like to just point out is that with this container layout, the current alignment of all of the elements inside of it is set to be centered. Whereas when I'm displaying my full search menu, I'd like these all to be aligned to the left-hand side. So over in my condition, I'm going to update the container alignment whenever the display full menu is set to yes. And I'll push these to the left-hand side. I will then select on my text element inside of my red group here. And I'm going to need to add some conditions onto this element. Before I do that though, I'm just going to jump to my layout tab and vertically align this in the center of this group. I will then jump to my conditional tab, and then I'm going to create a condition that only allows this text element to be displayed whenever we are showing our full menu, which means of course by default, I don't want this element to be visible when the page is loaded. So what I'm going to do is unselect that this element should be visible on page load. I will collapse it when it's hidden. I'll then jump to my conditional tab, and I'm going to recognize when, once again, our group search bar, when it's display full menu custom state, is in fact set to yes. I'm going to tick that this is visible and select that that should be true. I will then just toggle this on for the time being so I can see where this element is going to sit. With this element, I'd also just like to add in 10 pixels of margin on the left-hand side, so that way it's not touching our little magnifying glass there. And then the very last thing I'd like to do is just update the positioning of our magnifying glass just whenever we're displaying our full menu here. So I'm going to click on the magnifying glass, and I'm going to jump to my condition tab. I'm just going to recognize once again when the group search bar, when the display full menu custom state is in fact yes. I'd just like to add 10 pixels of margin to the left hand side, so that way it just pushes it over within my group. So I'm going to select that I want to add some left margin here, and I'll just add that in to be 10, and I can toggle that on to see what that is going to look like. And now look, that is everything I want to cover within our search experience. In my opinion, there wasn't a whole lot that we actually added into our app at this point in time, but there were just so many tedious little conditions and custom states that we needed to configure. So that's where this module can seem a little bit confusing if you've never used custom states in the past. So I'd really recommend that if you struggle to keep up with any of the concepts here, please pause the tutorial and rewatch them, so that way they make complete sense before we move on to the next stage in our build. What I really just want to do though now is show you a preview of how this is going to look, so that way you can see how a custom state is going to behave whenever we turn it on and off. Over in a preview of my homepage here, I'm going to go ahead and click on my search placeholder group. And what you'll see is that this is going to expand out and display my full search bar, which if I wanted, I could type in a destination. So let's say if I wanted to search for a city, I could say something like San Francisco, and it's automatically going to pull that up. I could select that. If I wanted to select a check-in date, I could do that, as well as a check-out date. At this point, we won't be able to add guests. I've got a dedicated section of our tutorial, which is going to cover how we can create that experience. And of course, we haven't yet built out the workflows to make our search actually functional. However, if I wanted to close this menu here, I could click on this little X and it's going to switch that custom state back to no, and then our search placeholder group will be placed in its position. Jumping back into my Notion checklist, I'm going to tick off that we're finished building out the first stage in our overall search experience. And at this point in time, we took care of most of the groundwork, which is going to make the rest of that feature completely functional. And at this point, that is all I have time to include within this tutorial. As you can see, we've been building for hours, and yet there's still so many features that I want to cover in as much detail as I possibly can. If you were interested in watching the rest of this course, I'd recommend hitting the link in my description where you can get access to the full course from my own website. And now, while this full course is going to cost you money, I'm confident that it's going to save you months of time having to learn how to rebuild all of these features from scratch yourself. So I definitely recommend checking it out if you wanted to launch your app as quickly as possible. Throughout that full course, it'll explain how to build all of the remaining features in my list today, which will include things like building a host dashboard page so hosts can manage their properties, being able to edit the details of existing properties, creating a dedicated property page to display the full details of each individual property, and from there, of course, being able to create new bookings for properties, which throughout that, I'm going to explain in detail how you can process payments using Stripe. We'll also create a feature that allows users to leave reviews on properties, as well as the ability to bookmark and save properties to a list that anyone can view at a later point in time. I really wasn't lying when I said that there is a whole suite of features that I'm still yet to cover to help bring our Airbnb clone to life. In the meantime though, if you wanted to stay up to date with any additional Bubble resources I share, I'd recommend hitting that subscribe button so you can be the first to know when I drop a new tutorial. I also just wanted to say a massive thank you for taking the time to watch up to this point in our tutorial today, and I wish you all of the best on your own no-code journey.